Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward.
I guess history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, or however it goes. What does that mean practically? In our world right now, at least 1 billion, I think 6, frankly, billion people dead. The 100 million of China through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward is pittance compared to what would happen if they're able to completely collapse the first world. Marx famously said, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, which is echoing Satan, because his idea was, if I can't have it, nobody should have it. So it's always revolution or destruction is what happens with Marxism.
The purpose of propaganda is to make one group of humans forget that another group of humans is human, something like that. Oh, that's a really good one. So you just put people in these buckets and then you're like, oh, demonize, kill, destroy, whatever. So central banking is Marxist money.
And then they get people to hate each other and blame each other, right?
Yeah.
Well, how do you do that? Do happy people hate each other? No. Do comfortable people hate each other? No. You have to inject pain into the system,
right.
And then you get the one group to blame the other group for the pain.
Right.
And then you tell the group that's being blamed that those people are trying to steal your stuff.
Meanwhile, it's the state doing the stealing. Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. I discovered your work on Twitter. As I was just telling you offline, this video of you, I guess, giving a presentation to the European Parliament, I think you said it was.
Yeah.
It's a 30-minute video. You are extemporizing, but I thought you were reading from a teleprompter or you had memorized the presentation or something, because it's so dense and it's so good, and it is a thorough annihilation of wokeism. And so every time people, are tweeting at me about, oh no, wokeism is just compassion for these other underprivileged or discriminated against people, then I have to respond and get into these arguments. And then typically I just send your videos like, kind of the sign off, like, if you really want to understand what this is, just watch this. So I wanted to talk to you about a lot of the things you went into in that video. It seemed to be like I don't know, like your whole thesis on wokeism basically compressed into 30 minutes, but there was a lot in there that I think we can double click on and expand.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the context might be useful for people. It's really kind of interesting. So it's a very conservative party they still have those in Europe, and they invited me over. They see woke on the horizon, but they don't feel like woke outside of maybe the issue of immigration is big for Europe right now. And so they see what's happening in America. They see what's happening in Canada, and to a degree, Great Britain. They see what's happening in Australia, and they're like, we don't want that here. And so they invited us over. They held this three conference series, and I was the first of the speakers. And they wanted me to lay down what's the threat to Europe. What is woke? So that's why I gave this kind of encapsulated summary. Turns out that's the best I've ever given a speech, I think, ever. So it's great that it was in that location. Yeah. And it goes viral like every time. So it must resonate with people. But the reason it, I think, is so straightforwardly put is I went out the night before with them, and they're from all these different countries or whatever. And the language barrier freaked me out. So I was like, I have to figure out how to say this and as cleanly and just pointedly, not too many big words, not too much fancy language. Yeah. And it's, even I look back at it sometimes and I'm like, whoa, I did that? All right.
Just having an on day. Well, thank God it was captured on camera, and I'm glad it's gone viral so many times because we need something pushing back against this mind virus. So what I thought we'd do today is like go through, I prepared an outline of points you went through in that presentation. That's why I want to dig into some of that with you. But before we jump in, I want to ask you about the definition of a concept that we explore on this show. On probably every episode it comes up, and that is the social institution of private property. Now, as I was telling you offline, it blows my mind still that when I bring up this term, most people think I'm talking about real estate. And I guess this is because you see, signs on a fence that says private property, keep out, no trespassing, etc. But even really smart people, like Wall Street types that you would think would have a more sophisticated understanding of the principle that holds civilization together. They think, private property is real estate, right? They don't even understand how it relates to money and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so I find myself getting a bit frustrated at times in that this is such a fundamental thing. It's almost like the purpose of civilization itself is really to get one another to respect each other's private property. And yet no one seems to understand it. So because no one understands it, the state can just violate it at will. And we end up having all of these problems, as we'll go into. So I thought it would be useful just to start there. Like, what are your views on the social institution of private property? Do you have a definition that you find particularly useful? Is there a way to get this message out to people with a little bit more clarity? Like, how do you approach this?
Well, I'll tell you, even having the conversation right now is eye-opening because it didn't ever occur to me until you told me these things, that people are unclear about what it means. Now, to say I'm going to pull a whole, Ketanji Brown Jackson or something. I'm not an economist, but I'm not going to probably end up giving a precise definition like I read it out of Webster. I don't know if I've ever looked it up. It's one of these things we kind of tacitly understand, and I thought people tacitly understood it, but I don't think they do after hearing you. And so what is it? If I'm thinking through it, kind of literally on the fly, it is an abstracted extension of the idea of stuff that other people don't have the authority to take from you. And I think that's the private part. Property is stuff. But stuff includes ideas as well, intellectual property we all know about. So the key part really is that other people don't have the authority to take it from you. And so this is deep actual political philosophy that we're already running into because not all societies agree with this, and not all societies have agreed with this. Obviously, Marxism is designed. Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, chapter 2, it's right there. He says, communism can be summarized in a single sentence: abolish private property. And so that's a different organizational principle. And you say for civilization, well, look at communist countries. They're not civilization.
Right. They're hell.
They're hell. Yeah. And so it doesn't work. So I tend to agree with you. Our concept of private property in a kind of deep political philosophical sense really derives from people like John Locke, probably Adam Smith as well to some degree, but John Locke in particular was contemplating the idea of let's get like real, just kind of parable style, storytelling. I go out into the woods, I find a cool stick, I, put my effort and labor into, say, getting it out of the woods, carving it nice, have a nice walking stick. The walking stick is mine because I appropriated that which was in nature through my efforts and my vision to make it something that's useful and interesting to me. And therefore, I have a claim upon it that's rooted in the vision and risk and energy and input that work that I put into procuring it as this thing that I've now, claimed to be mine. And that becomes the basis, whether it's land, whether it's, the walking stick or any other physical object. And the idea was for Locke, a couple of things. One is if I made it, I have a claim on it. If I found this, rock stick, whatever it happens to be, and I had the vision of building a home out of these things, and I did, then it's mine. And I get to have a claim on it. If I, set up a boundary around this parcel of land and I manage the land and I use it to grow what I need and so on, then I have a claim to this land because I've put my effort into it and making a livelihood out of it. And what he actually thought was that this is absolutely essential to being able, Locke was a very devout man, so this immediately goes like religious for him. Is that if somebody can take away your property, they're taking away, first of all, what it really, in a sense, means to be you. They can take that away, but they can also, at threat of taking away your property, so assuming the authority to take yours, they can compel you to believe otherwise. So they could compel you to believe in the wrong God or the wrong religion or whatever else. So fundamentally, securing the right to property for the classical liberal tradition that follows from Locke and these other thinkers is how you get to define yourself as an individual that cannot be imposed upon by the usurped authority of someone else. And when you extend that out, in a political environment, the state becomes kind of this embodiment often of somebody else, but not just. I can't come into your house and steal your stuff. And the idea of the United States, which is Jefferson following Locke and Madison following Jefferson and Locke and these other guys, was that the state's job, its primary job, is not just property, also life and liberty, is to secure individuals from either other individuals, from corporate activity of groups or gangs or cartels, or from the state itself, whether that state's just or unjust, whether the state is operating as they call it, a just government, or whether it's operating as its own cartel. Individuals, so that they can be individuals, so that, as Jefferson put it, they can pursue their happiness. But as that's actually a follow-up from Locke. Locke said you should be able to have your property because it allows you to pursue your happiness and your fulfillment in life. But it's really to preserve your ability to be who you are as an individual. Individualism is predicated on that other people can't kill you, other people can't lock you up, and other people can't basically put you into poverty by stealing your stuff. And so they fundamentally understood that if you secure those things, you free up the individual to be able to do commerce, activity, religion, everything that it means to be who you are and a productive member of a society. So when you say it's the foundational fabric of our civilization, it really is. I mean, on a super deep level.
That's fantastic. I like how you're adding the element of if someone is able to steal from you or violate your property, that they can use that to compel you to adopt different ideologies or follow different religions, because that's a key point. I think it was Locke too that he was saying it's this ontological reality that each individual owns themselves, right?
That's right.
That only I can move my arms and use my willpower, etc. That inalienable control over oneself,
right?
That becomes extended into nature as the institution of private property through the process you describe. And so that actually becomes undone in a way. If someone can violate your property, well, then they can use that to, I wouldn't say it's to coerce you, basically, right? You can, again, it's inalienable self-ownership. You can never give it up. But if someone puts a gun to your head, well,
Right.
you're still self-owned, right? You can still choose to respond. However, you're doing it under duress.
That's right.
And so that, I think, feeds in nicely to what we'll talk about shortly, that this whole idea of wokeism being another form of that.
Yeah, cancel culture is obviously that.
Yeah.
They don't put a gun to your head, they put a gun to your career, your ability to make a living, your ability to, obtain, whether it's money or, the means to secure your own property.
Yes.
And that's what they put under, one of the things they put under threat. And what's the objective?
Yes.
Is to get you to adopt their view of the world. It is to, as Mao had it, to see the world from the people's perspective.
Yes. Yeah, it's fantastic. And excellent framing, I think, for going into the next question. So I get one more thing I would say about this, just for the useful definition that I found for private property: the relationship between an individual and the things they own, basically, right? Yeah. And then that relationship is supposed to be exclusive. Like,
that's right.
This is mine. I decide who uses it and who doesn't. I have the right to exclude others from its use.
Right. It's fundamental.
And this relationship is established as, in the process you described, this relationship is for purposes of conflict avoidance, right?
That's right.
Rather than
exactly
everyone
right.
fighting over every asset all the time, we can just have ledgers saying kind of who owns what, and socially acknowledged exclusive relationships between owners and assets.
Yeah, exactly.
That's essential to human civilization. It's almost the definition of human civilization in a way. And as you said too, life and liberty are part of that, really, because you have to be able to own yourself and move freely to have these property relationships.
Right. And that's what makes it, what's so central and different about what we usually now call Western civilization or whatever, is that the question at the bottom is, who has the authority to step in and come in between somebody and their property, their life, or their liberty? And the answer is a profound answer. It's not the king. It's nobody. Nobody. Right. The answer in a theological sense is none of us are God. Yeah. If that authority exists, it rests only with God. Therefore, none of us has the authority to take somebody else's property, to interrupt that relationship, to compel them in belief, to lock them up, to force them to do something, or to take away their life. And so I think this is profoundly Christian, frankly. I think it actually unlocks human potential, as the evidence of the past several centuries show. The societies that have done this just flourish. Yeah. Prosperity's everywhere. Yeah. And the societies that don't, even China, which is, it's a very bustling place. You can marvel at how fast they can build buildings, highways, neighborhoods, cars, ships, what have you. I mean, we can talk about the quality problems or whatever, but that's not the point. What China lacks, and everybody kind of knows it, but nobody really admits it. And I shouldn't say China, what the People's Republic of China lacks is innovation. Yeah. Because people are not freed up to be individuals who are able to express themselves, take what risks they want with what is theirs, and they are compelled. So what you end up is, it's like a competitive societal matrix of obedience instead of one of innovation and taking risks and breaking out of the mold. Right.
Which makes perfect sense when you consider the incentive structure they're inhabiting. That's right. They're not able to keep as much of the fruits of their labor. So whereas the risk-taking incentive is not there, whereas I guess the incentive, instead of going from 0 to 1, which is, takes a lot of risk tolerance, the incentive is instead to focus on going from 1 to many, which China does really well, right? Once we innovate something over here, they'll copy it, scale it, sell it.
Rolex instead of Rolex.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so capital is another strange word, but obviously Marx wrote the book Capital, so I think it's probably useful to just try and define that before we go into looking at wokeism as cultural Marxism rebranded.
Yeah, sure. That's a pretty good idea.
I will offer up a definition, and I would just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, go.
One that I've heard that's useful is economic potential energy. I think this is a bit abstract. I think
I like it.
It works, but it's a bit abstract. I like to think of capital as anything that accelerates one on the course of attaining their aim. So this is why you have things that are not, obviously a tool, right?
Yeah.
You can dig more holes per hour with a shovel than you can your bare hands. So a tool is capital, right? But it could be something as ephemeral or non-tangible as a reputation, right? A reputation could help you get deals done more quickly than you otherwise could. And you also hear people talk about things like human capital, right? It's like, well, if you have a hierarchy or you have a team of people, well, they can help you get things done more quickly.
Right.
So I'll offer that up as a definition, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the term capital and in particular as it pertains to the cultural Marxism stuff.
Yeah, those are great, actually. I was, again, just to kind of riff a little bit, just so everybody knows, we're doing this on the spot.
Yeah.
And so I would have said, if you wanted a definition of capital that distinguishes it from private property, it's just in the broader sense, is that it's private property that is specifically productive private property. It's private property. There's an old saying that it's money that you can, a pile of money that you can turn into a bigger pile of money in some sense. So it's that which you can somehow invest, which is, like you said, it's like potential, it's economic potential energy. So that really makes sense. It's whether it's tools, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's even reputation, things like that. It's that stuff that even in the very abstract domains of private property, that isn't just frivolous. It's something that you can actually put to productive use one way or another, which turns out to be a lot of most of private property can be construed or used as capital. But particularly, I think when we use the word capital, we're thinking of assets that are in some way being put to productive use one way or another. And so Marx had a term for this, and right before that infamous sentence in the Communist Manifesto, he had the whole framing of that is he talked about that there's what he calls individual property, which is just made up term. And then he contrasts that with what he calls bourgeois private property. And so that's private property, that's your own stuff, that now has bourgeois values tied into it. And what that is the capacity to produce. Or for him, it's the capacity to get other people to produce your vision on your behalf. So you come up with a company you want to build, you need 10 guys to be able to do what all the different tasks are or whatever, and so you employ them, and Marx believes that you're ruining these people's lives because you are keeping them from producing their own vision in the world by getting them to produce yours instead. And so everything that goes into that for him is bourgeois private property. But although a little further than that too, because anything that can be withheld, that fundamental right to exclude that comes with private property rights, he was very against that. That's a bourgeois idea. If Marx needs it and you're not using it, you should definitely let Marx have it. And so he can use it. That's kind of the whole idea. Of course, we know about the tragedy of the commons and that this is a catastrophe. And who wants a life like that anyway? It's people who don't want to go get their own stuff, which is Marx to a T. But that's what they're really after. They're after this idea of destroying productive property that can generate more property.
Yeah, right. Well, it's the from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right? Which is another core tenet of Marxism.
Yeah, which is total bogus.
Yeah, it sounds romantic and like nice, and probably works in your household.
Yeah, it works in families or tightly knit tribes.
Exactly, and that's why I think it works on people, right? Like it sounds good in a small scale. So you're like, oh, why can't we all just do that? But obviously, these things are scale variant, right? What works at the family level will not work at the city level.
That's right,
etc. What and Marx too is correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he think that machines actually did not increase human productivity? So it's kind of ironic that he writes the book Capital, but then he has an economic thesis in there that like mechanization and standardization actually did not increase human productivity.
Yeah, because he comes up with a weird definition of product. So it's making a lot of stuff, but it's not real. It's making commodities. It's not making the true output of human activity. So there's almost, I mean, this weird romanticism of the artisan,
Yeah.
Carving away at the thing by hand, and it's almost like this romantic vision that when you do that, you put a piece of your soul in it.
Yeah.
But when the machine carves the exact same thing and maybe to higher standards, well, now it's a soulless, dead thing.
Huh.
So he separated out the concepts of production and commodities, and he was really against the commodity form. So yeah, quite against the industrialization in pretty much all regards. And this is the trait that they have, though, which is to just start misusing words in order to make their case.
Right.
So here it's, productive. He misuses the word. He gives it some cockamamie definition that suits his need. He has these other concepts. I just read this book recently, and it's kind of hot in these circles today. I don't know if you know about the degrowth phenomenon.
No.
Oh, God. Yeah. It's a whole thing. But we don't have to get into that yet. But the guy is a communist, a Japanese communist, Kohei Saito, wrote this book about degrowth communism, the idea to degrow our economies, make them smaller in order to preserve, to stop what he calls metabolic rift. It's to have basically, in the real lingo, a more sustainable and inclusive economy. But what they do is they make the case that capitalism is based on scarcity. So capitalism, they then say, produces scarcity. How? Well, if you can own something and fundamentally exclude other people from it, then that means it's a scarce resource. But it was the idea that you can exclude that made it scarce. And you're already like, what is happening? So then they say that what communism then produces is abundance, because there's an abundance of natural resources, there's an abundance of having access to things, and therefore it produces wealth in the sense of a true wealth, a common wealth, and wealth in terms of what it really means to live. We have more leisure time, so we're wealthier. That we might all live in shanties, but I mean, and so you can read this and just, if you don't know that they do it, you read it and it's a completely confusing argument. Then when you read it and understand that what they're doing is kind of flipping around the meanings of all the words, so that their argument from their worldview makes sense as an argument.
Right.
But in reality, it's not talking. I mean, the words are all misused. Everything is not real. And then when they speak, they come out and say, well, capitalism's done great. It's produced a lot of commodities for people. And what it hasn't done is truly produce. It hasn't produced human well-being. It hasn't produced true abundance. We have all this stuff, but all we do is work. We don't have any time to enjoy it. So it's not actually that abundant. And look, there's some people who still don't have enough. It can't even cover it. And so this is the magic spell that they do, but they're misusing all the words. And Marx did that. There's a word for this that we don't use very often in modern language in a kind of serious sense. The word for this is magician or wizard. They're manipulating people's understanding by manipulating the meanings of the words in a disingenuous way that serves their agenda to get you to go along with it.
Right.
Magic is psychology.
Yes.
If I were, I'm not, so don't expect any card tricks. But if I did a card trick and you were like, whoa, how'd you do that? I didn't manipulate. I mean, I had to move the cards around, but I didn't manipulate reality. I manipulated your perception of what's going on.
Right.
It's all psychology.
Yeah, what's coming up for me here is I've been reading the book Philosophical Investigations by Wittgenstein. And he talks about language games.
That's
or
right.
Language being a game, actually. And so this sounds like a lot of that, is they changing the definitions of words, or even what you just said about scarcity, right? Like, yeah, the starting point of all economics is scarcity, which there is more demand than there is supply.
At which
for a
point,
thing.
if I were a Marxist, I'd say, aha, you admit it.
Yeah, but that is like the natural reality, right? It's like, it's what are you going to do about it? Are you going to bid for it in a peaceful pricing system, or we're going to fight over it, basically, right? You have to resolve the dispute over the scarce resource. You do it the peaceful way or the unpeaceful way. If these are language games being played, what do you think the actual agenda is of the people playing these language games? Or do you think these, like the communist author you just mentioned, do they believe in their heart of hearts that communism is this solution? Or are they playing a game to try and manipulate people's minds for some other agenda?
I'm going to say yes. I think that on the one hand, I think that a lot of them are diehard full-on believers in this cult religion that believes human beings' true nature is socialist. The idea of private property estranges him from himself. That's what Marx actually wrote. He said that communism is this is an exact quote from his 1844 manuscripts. He says true communism, because he's contrasting it against the hatred of capitalism, which he called crude. Crude communism is hating private property. True communism is the positive transcendence of private property as a form of human self-estrangement. So the idea is we're actually socialists. We're actually one huge tribe called humanity that shares in perfect measure. Everybody contributes according to what they can give. Everybody receives according to what they need. And that's what we really are. And we've all forgotten that because we've estranged ourselves from ourselves by the introduction of private property. And I think that these people believe it. For example, the degrowth model is based off of an idea from Marx in the third volume of Capitalism called metabolic rift. It's so hard to talk about these things because the terminology, there's so much to unpack. Metabolic rift, he believed that we are in coexistence with nature. And so it's like a metabolism. When we go out and we gather resources, we metabolize them into things that are useful for us, much like we would if we ate food, we'd metabolize it into nutrients that our body uses. But humanity is now using this, and that we're going to have this rift where we are over-consuming and going to destroy the planet and so on. This whole idea that we would create a complete divorce from nature that ends up in catastrophe shows up in the third volume of Capital. And the guy that I was talking about, and I brought all that up, all the technical business up, just to say the guy that I was talking about, you can tell he's completely bought into the idea of metabolic rift being a real problem, and Marx had the right read on it and the right solution to it, and we just have to get back to it. So I think that guy's a true believer. On the other hand, because of its nature as being subjective, or at least partially subjective, their theory is, in fact, that there is no objective truth. All truth is subjective and objective together at the same time in some measurement. You have the fact and its interpretation. And that's fundamental to their beliefs. It turns out that when you go into the increasing amount of subjective being treated as though it's got the same standard as objective, you open the door to charlatans who do know it's false and don't care because they can just get advantage. How do you weed them out? It's very, that sounds abstract. It's very palpable, extremely palpable if we switch over to some of these, race hustlers that are operating in the critical race theory world. All you have to do is have a minority identity or claim to speak on behalf of a minority identity as a white Karen or whatever. All you have to do is have that and then say, I'm offended. What if I'm not offended and I just want you to give me $20, right? Or I want you to change how you run your policy. What if I pretend I'm offended? We just had this in Congress with the Marjorie Taylor Greene yelling at Jasmine Crockett or whatever, and they get in their huge fight, and then Marjorie, because she snapped about her fake eyelashes or whatever, and then a day later, Jasmine Crockett's reinterpreted this to where that was a racist comment because it's like, she said on CNN that it was a ghetto presentation and she was tapping into racist tropes. I mean, I don't know if black women or white women wear fake eyelashes more often. I just know a lot of them do, and I don't care. But she was able to say that it's racist. Is it? I don't know. That's news to everybody, I guess. But she knows that she can use that as a lever. Was she really? I'm sure she was offended that she got called out for her fake eyelashes because she acted offended. But was she offended like in a racial way? Probably. She didn't show any indication of it right away, so probably not. But then she can add that interpretation in later. And the question is, how do you stop the person who's just making it up?
Right.
Or with this queer theory side of things, which is the sex, gender, sexuality aspect, and we can get into the details of that another time. You have somebody who comes in and they're a true believer and they want to, either claim to help, gay kids in a school or whatever find themselves and understand who they are. Maybe that's a weird but noble cause. Or they are activists who want to transform more people to be like them, which, that's one kind of ideological grooming or whatever. Or maybe they are literally just a predator who wants to take advantage of that situation. How do you weed them out? Once you've stepped into that domain where the subjective feeling of offense defines everything. So the problem is that when you get with something like Marxism, because you're incorporating more subjectivity, you can't weed out true believers from grifters very easily. You don't have the tools. So the answer to which is it is both. And I gave a long answer to that. So unfortunately, I forgot the very interesting first half of your question. If you remember, we can go back.
No. I think that was actually the answer. It's like, do they believe in their heart of hearts, whether it's true or not? But
some of them do.
Some
of them are taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like anything. If it's Christianity, you have people pose as pastors. You have people go to church just so they can get political connections, but they don't believe. On the other hand, you got guys that are all in,
and so for those that don't actually believe what they're saying, the underlying agenda would just be personal gain of some kind. Right. Yeah.
Personal gain, usually political power.
Yeah.
Because that's the object of worship.
Right.
Therefore, that's the thing you really get a vehicle to. But look at the contracts. If you look at this woke stuff in schools, they're like, sometimes you can get $3 million out of the municipality or whatever.
Wow.
So there's a lot of money in these kind of grifter contracts.
Yeah.
You see this, actually, people keep getting busted. The DEI coordinator of this or the city official of that, and they're always like throwing contracts to their husband or to whatever else. The Black Lives Matters women were building mansions and throwing parties and stuff with all of that money. Right. So
what about the modern communist or modern Marxist ideology? The other issue that I take is they look out on the world and say, oh, look what capitalism has done, right? You typically use this term late stage capitalism. Yet there's no discussion. Again, if Marx defines Marxism as the abolition of private property, socialism, this is Hoppe's definition, but I think it's useful. It's institutionalized aggression against private property. And then capitalism would be institutionalized respect for private property.
Okay.
How can you look out on the world today with all of this violation of private property occurring through taxation, inflation, fiat regulation, and call this late stage capitalism? Like, how do they assign all of the bad things to capitalism and then say socialism or Marxism will fix all of these things? Is there no admission that, or do they even consider private property as part of, as defining the capitalism? And if it's being aggressed against, maybe they don't define taxation and inflation as aggression against private property.
I'm sure they don't.
Yeah.
I want to paradigm shift you a little bit on how you think about Marxism, though. And we just touched on it, so it's just going to flow. It's crucial to think of Marxism more as a religious architecture that people believe in than as a economic theory that's being engaged in dispassionately.
Right.
And as a religious theory, there's this old saying, it doesn't matter what the theory is, so I'll say it with socialism. It's not that socialism can fail, it's that people fail socialism, right? So the problem isn't socialism, it's that people weren't sufficiently awakened to what it means to be a socialist.
That wasn't real socialism.
That wasn't real socialism. Yeah. And communism can never actually be tried because communism is the heaven state that you arrive at after enough socialism so that people actually finally fully get it. So it's like the magic state when everybody's fully awakened as a full-blown socialist. So they're able to expropriate the blame for everything that happens as a result of their aggression against private property or as a result of socialism and say, no, it wasn't socialism or socialism's fault. It was the fault of people having the wrong or insufficiently developed values. So they were incorporating or they were putting into play elements that are still self-interested instead of species interested. That Marx called the ideal state of humanity a species being, a being that lives for the entire species. And so their values hadn't been sufficiently developed. So it was their fault. And that actually shows the basis of like every communist purge. The communism's not working, people are dying, stuff's getting bad, the rabble is getting up, the masses are getting upset. And they say, well, the reason is, and this is how you end up getting a purge or a mass murder campaign with maybe 10 million graves. The reason is because there are so many people still among us who have capitalist values that they haven't fully, as Mao would put it, reformed their thought. And he literally used that terminology. They hadn't remolded themselves ideologically. So it's still capitalism is like this evil demon. So if we take this religious paradigm, what does private property represent in that? And it is the fall, like the story in Genesis. It is the fall of man from his true state in Eden. Eden was a communist utopia, And then along comes this idea, somebody sins by eating the fruit of the knowledge of owning stuff and decides, I can have this and you can't. And all of a sudden, mankind falls away from who he is. And you say, well, James, you're getting out there. I take you back to Marx's definition in 1844, before he wrote Manifesto, before he wrote Capital, everything. 1844, his definition of true communism was the positive transcendence, that's already a religious terminology, transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, that which made us fall from being truly human. And so if you understand that they believe that private property, or the belief in the right to private property, is the fall of man.
Wow.
And that's what they're trying to get rid of. They're trying to purge that original sin out of the world. Everything they're doing makes sense. But then at that point in that religious architecture, what they're doing is attempting a cure. And when it doesn't work, it's not that the cure is insufficient.
Right.
It's that the original sin is still there, and which means the solution is you need even more.
More cure.
Yeah.
It's like an unfalsifiable thing, right? It's like,
It is.
no matter how much socialism, no matter how much private property they aggress against, they don't get the ideal solution. That you never attain communism.
Yeah.
So the answer is just more.
That's right. It is.
So it's
And
more
it is
stealing, more
unfalsifiable.
killing, more stealing, more killing.
Because when you look out to the world, you get facts. You do not get interpretation.
Right.
And so for them, there is an enlightened position on what it means to be human. A woke position on what it means to be human.
Right.
And for Marx, that was being a socialist.
Right.
He believed he understood man's true nature. So he begins with believing man is a social being who doesn't know it. And everything follows from there. Everything follows from there. Because it's unfalsifiable, because he's now made a conclusion that's really the end point at the beginning.
Right.
And then they even are explicit. They say things like that they love the logic of the circle, or the circle is the magic shape that presupposes at its end at the same place that it began. I mean, they're all into this, and it's
So
what's the classic archetypal symbol for that? It's a snake eating its own tail.
Right. The Ouroboros.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they love their circular logic, I guess.
Exactly. And this is why, other philosophers, Eric Vogelin is
Yeah.
very famous for this, controversial guy, but I think he's right, said that Marx was a charlatan. He says that you can actually read Marx and you can tell he knows that he started with his conclusion. But that's where all circular logic and that's where all unfalsifiable cult ideologies go. They start with their conclusion and then they fit the world around it.
Yes. No. Fantastic. So let's dive into this video that you did a little bit. And I want to start with the definition you put forth of equity. And this is a definition that came from the public administration literature, I think you said.
Yeah, that's right.
And now, typically when I know this is more like DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because typically when I hear the word equity, I'm thinking like equity versus debt, right? And that world.
Like real equity.
Yes, real equity. So I want to be clear, this is the definition now, not the proper definition, the definition that's coming from public administration literature for...
It's the definition in another domain.
Yes.
It's not the capital definition of equity.
Right.
It's another domain. The domain is public administration. It's actually shorthand for what's called social equity or social equity theory. So I'll give you some background and I'll give you the definition. But the background is we're looking in the 60s. There had been this book written in the 40s by a guy named Dwight Waldo. And that book was, I think, called The Administrative State, if I'm not mistaken. I might have this mixed up. I'm like, oh no, is that right? It's the internet. Somebody will look it up. Dwight Waldo's correct. It's a hilarious name. So he writes this book. He puts on this conference in 68. So the book was in 48, 45, something like that, 45, I think. And he has this conference for it called the Minnowbrook Conference in 68. And public administration up to that point had been focused on two variables that they had to optimize across. And those were efficiency and economy. How much does it cost and how can we do it in less time or for less materials? And so the thinking was that a responsible public administrative apparatus needs to be as economical and efficient as possible. So it's anytime you optimize across two variables, it's more complicated. And they were saying, well, this is causing all these problems if we just focus on these. So let's add a third variable that also happens to start with an E, equity. The public administration apparatus has a responsibility to administer so that things become more fair in society. And so the actual explanation of this comes from a guy named H. George Fredrickson. The actual definition for equity, I've tooled around the language that they actually use to make it concise, is that it's an administered system in which shares are adjusted so that participants are made equal. The way that Fredrickson actually articulated it is equality means citizen A and citizen B get the same thing. Equity means shares are adjusted so that citizens A and B are made equal. And so it's an administered system. So it's public administration apparatus, some kind of bureaucracy. And the goal is to move shares around so that whoever the participants are, not necessarily because they've earned anything or whatever, are made more equal. Now, the
quality of outcome, then.
it is a quality of outcome. It's socialism.
Yeah.
It's the same definition. If you were to define it in its classical sense, a political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal, you'd have the definition of socialism. And so it's exactly the same concept, but now it's kind of spread out largely through the concept of public admin, which can then dip into anything. Are there racial disparities? Did we do redlining? What's happened that we have to correct for to try to make participants or citizens more equal than they were at the beginning? And they took this on as a responsibility of the field of public administration. In other words, of the bureaucratic administrative apparatuses of the state. And I'm almost positive Waldo's book was called The Administrative State. I read it. It's not that engaging, but it's kind of the...
Doesn't sound like it would be.
No, it's kind of the... I don't know that it's the basis for the administrative behemoth, but it kind of is theoretically. It's in the 40s, so it's early work in that domain. And they thought that there's a responsibility for administrative apparatuses to make the people in there have a more equal outcome. They don't particularly articulate how that's supposed to happen, because equity in the real sense or in the financial sense is that you're getting your fair return on your investment, which means people don't understand investments at all. People are so bad at understanding investments. They don't know why. I used to teach compound interest, basic math when I taught math. And it's like I was like, do you know why interest exists? And they had no idea. And I was like, well, it's really simple. There's something called the time value of money. If you have money, or capital at all, you can do stuff with it between, say, January and December, in one calendar year. You can do stuff with it. And that stuff might be, as we said earlier, taking a pile of money to get a bigger pile of money. And so the interest is supposed to reflect what you productively could have done in some sense on average if you had kept the money yourself and used it productively during that time. And then if I give it to you, you can go do that productivity. And this is why ships rise, because let's say that my capacity is that I could get a 7% ROI in a year. That's just my skill, right? Whatever it is, whether I'm building, lemonade stands or whatever. But you come along and you're like, dude, I have an idea. Here's what we're going to do. And I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And you sell me on your idea and you're like, I'm not positive, but I'm going to take a risk. I think I can make a 16% ROI with that same amount of money this year. And so I'm like, okay, here's the deal. I could have made 7%. Here's the money. Go do it. And if you make 16%, you pay me my 7%. That's the whole idea right there. And when you put it that way, it's like, oh, that makes sense. So equity is your fair return.
Symmetry of risk and reward.
That's exactly right.
Because if it goes south, you also bear the risk.
That's right. So equity in the financial sense is that you get your fair share of the risk that you're taking by outlaying your capital over a period of time. Which, you can throw money right in a hole. You can really mess up. You could you invest in the stupidest thing in the world, and people have done it. People have lost billions of dollars in a click. It happens. So this is an extraordinarily important concept under what's going on, but they're like, hey, no, let's just adjust shares. So imagine you showed up at like Wall Street or whatever, right? And now you're going to say, at the end of the day, what we're going to do, no matter how good the trader, no matter how good the brokerage firm, whatever, we're going to take all the positive value that came out from the day, and we're just going to adjust it so that everybody who played today comes out a little bit ahead.
Participation trophies all the way around.
It's participation financial participation trophies across the board. The problem is you're no longer accurately assessing the risk versus reward cycle.
That's right.
And so you're now throwing in a monkey variable that's not going to work. And what happens is actually you're rewarding non-productive activity as though it's productive activity.
Yes.
And by definition, you therefore, to have the capital to do that, have to punish productive activity.
Yes.
If you would have earned 16%, sorry, you can only have 12.
Right.
And you're like, what the heck?
Yeah.
I worked hard, and James is a good guy. I like him, and his family's cool, but like he only put in for 7%. Like, what the heck?
No, it's absolutely insane, and that's the right way to look at it, is from an incentive standpoint, right? Because you are, and Hoppe goes into this in depth, right? Like, you are rewarding non-productive, even anti-productive behavior, right? Like, people are destroying capital, right?
Yeah.
Like, they still get their fair share, quote unquote,
fair share,
their pro rata share of the positive outcome. So you're stealing from productive people to give to non-productive or even anti-productive or destructive people. And that destroys all incentive to be productive. Like, why, if I can't keep what I earn or win, why would I apply my ingenuity? Why would I work hard?
Why would you take a risk?
Why would you take a risk at all? Yeah. And this is the same thing as like when people get, the government gives people paychecks to stay at home and sit on their ass. It's like, well, are you surprised that there's unemployment in the marketplace? Why would someone get up and go to work if they're getting paid roughly the same thing to sit at home?
Right. And so the other thing it creates then is this literal godlike mentality in the administrative apparatus. Well, we know what people need. We are no longer optimizing around efficiency and economy, which are objective variables. We now know how the shares should be moved around.
Right.
The market's not deciding that, which is really this kind of aggregation of productive outputs deciding who gets the rewards of those productive outputs. It's not perfectly efficient. There's ways to cheat it. There's all kinds of, eddy currents or whatever metaphor you want. But that's the principle behind the market, at least, is that productivity is getting rewarded as equitably as possible to what the productivity you produced. Now you have this apparatus, this bureaucratic apparatus that knows better than that about how money has to go around. And to be completely fair, I'm certain they solve some problems sometimes. But the problem is, it's like with medicine, right? You don't give everybody chemotherapy just because some people have cancer.
Right.
That's got to be really targeted interventions with exactly the kind of intervention, by the way, that if you went to something that has standing to lose, like a bank. So if you go to the bank and you say, hey, look, I got this idea, I need a loan so I can get this and that. The bank, if it's being responsible, will just kind of pretend to go back in time. And I mean a private bank. They're going to run an actuarial calculation on what's the probability that I'm going to get mine back with interest and at this rate, because that's basically on average what we do for giving out money, some of which goes bad. And so they run a calculation and they determine if you're worth handing that risk to. That's not what a public administrative apparatus does at all. These people are just like above the fray, and they decide, well, here's a sad story, so let's throw money at them.
Right.
They aren't figuring out, like, here's an example. They say that, people that win the lottery, nobody deserves to win the lottery by definition, right? There's no cosmic force that says so-and-so deserves to win the lottery. It's just blind luck. I mean, you got to play, but beyond that, it's blind luck. And so what's the statistics? I don't know them exactly, but the last I heard, it's something like 5% of people who win the lottery come out with a changed life, better prospects, and 95, something like that. Maybe it's 90-10, it doesn't matter. The vast majority end up back where they were a few years later. It's like when Vanilla Ice hit Ice Ice Baby, made $12 million, bought a mansion for $13 million, never had another hit, broke, right? It's the same story. It's a lot of people, turns out, that win the lottery don't know how to manage money. They don't know what to do with it when they have it. So you wouldn't, as an investor, if you were like a VC or whatever, you wouldn't throw a lottery ticket winning, value onto them. They're going to show up and, some like Gary Tan at Y Combinator is going to give you $500 million to go sit on your butt and smoke pot or something.
Right.
Like, that's not going to happen. And so these administrative apparatus people, they don't do that.
Right.
They hear the pity case and they say throw money at it. And they see a problem and they throw money at stupid programs that somebody came up with or that some grifter thought up. And so there's not that vetting process. And why does the vetting process work? because the person doing, if it's a private bank, stands to lose hard if they make a bad call.
Because they have skin in the game.
They have skin in the game.
It's their money.
That's right.
At play, not
That's
someone
exactly
else's
right.
money, unlike the
That's
bureaucrats.
exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, again, when you look at it through the lens of, I guess, capital or property, things become much clearer, right? This is why we say things like follow the money.
Right.
And Hoppe makes that point too, that he actually thinks it's the violation of private property that destroys incentives in that way, right? Like, so you basically say the higher the revenues of the state, basically, through whether it's money printing or direct taxation, that's more institutionalized violation of private property. He contributes that to a degradation for the incentive to be productive, to be a good person. Actually, he takes it so far into it leading to moral decay. You're not rewarding like cooperative long-term trading relationships. You're rewarding short-term scammy rhetorical
and
people.
the values and integrity and so on that you have to develop to have that.
Yes.
To bring to the table.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. So now let's look at it through the Marxist religious lens, right? So how would they see it? So what I've described so far is just the administrative apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
This administrative apparatus could be fairly responsible. It could be grounded largely in reality. It could be actually looking at, whether, I guess it has to be by definition, disparate outcomes, trying to figure out where's good money go, this thing is in all government bureaucracies are susceptible to be infiltrated and subverted by Marxists, because that's what Marxists want, is to run those. They want to control the means of production.
Exactly.
And so what would the Marxist religion do looking at this situation? Well, what they're going to see is that the people who are the losers in society, they don't have the correct interpretation for why that is. There are people out there who are not very productive, but that's not their fault. They've been alienated from their true nature. They have these problems. It's not their fault. Capitalism's actually keeping them down by holding them to a standard that's not possible. So what do we have to do? Well, those people, who are people supposed to be? We're supposed to be socialists. Well, the people who understand more of that, who have a socialist value structure, they're on the right path already. So we got to throw money at them. And the people who are the victims of the capitalist machine, we got to throw money at them. And so what you have at that point is like the incentives are not even just misaligned by, kind of a poisonous empathy or whatever. The incentives actually at that point start rewarding cult members, literally cult members. And then the tokens, like if it's socialism, it's, the masses, the people, the poor people. And if it's CRT, it's the racial minorities. And if we can do the whole thing. So they have this new idea that the people who have the right cult mentality and the tokens they hold up are the just winners of that redistribution of wealth and productivity. And it's the worst when they are giving that, and the preponderance of it in all practical experiments goes to the loyalists to the party. In other words, the people who have joined the cult.
Right.
So at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're establishing a corrupt state religion that is a religion of socialism that believes man's true human nature is socialist, and the people who are more awake to that deserve more of the fruits of society, even though they're not earning them, because they're just more virtuous in the virtue system that you have. It all makes sense when you understand that this is really what it's all about. It's not an economic system at all.
No, it's the state religion is the best way to frame it. And the most, I don't know if it's the most, a very pernicious aspect of that is you're now rewarding those that are most loudly proselytizing the state religion, right? The non-productive people with the fruits of the productive people. And the more you do that, the more you reduce the incentive for the productive to be productive, or you incentivize them to leave, right? To go somewhere else where they can keep the fruits of their labor.
Yeah.
And so this thing self-destructs, right?
Yeah.
Like, because eventually there's nothing else left to steal, right?
So it's pretty funny, and people should look up the graphic.
Or read the book Atlas Shrugged if you want to see this played out, right? It just...
well, of course.
Yeah.
But the graphic for degrowth communism, which was published in what's their magazine? Is it called the Monthly Review, I think, is the socialist magazine. Sure. I don't peruse a lot of socialist magazines. I don't know. I read their old books. But they've got this emblem. If you look up Degrowth Communism and Socialist Review, and the picture, there it is. It's a drain. It is a circle of energy going down to a hole. in the middle.
To a circular bioeconomy.
So the claim is that they are going to be able to make it shrink, the economy, shrink it down to the circular middle, a much smaller economy, and then just keep it at that level forever.
Wow.
But the image, the drawing itself
That's a
is
drain.
water going down a drain. What that is productivity and value and capital. And
So is this like brutal irony, or is, or what?
it's like
they take this seriously, though.
yeah, they do. But you want to know what you say is it brutal irony?
Yeah.
It's like when the churches put up a sign that say the most powerful positions on your knees. They're so caught up in their interpretation of, that means praying.
Right.
That they say something that any 15-year-old boy would have been like, no. I think that's what that is.
Wow.
And they're super proud of this. It's like the picture has a citation, for God's sake.
Wow. Holy shit. That's incredible. The farm at Okefenokee is a revolutionary new regenerative agricultural community. It features an 8,000 tree olive orchard, which they use to make their own olive oil, as well as a very large pecan orchard. All the animals on the farm are heritage animals, with some varieties over 100 years old and others thousands of years old. Fresh eggs are produced daily by the farm's chickens. Also, there are over 1,000 beehives that pollinate the over 200 heirloom fruits and vegetables and provide honey to all the residents. The farm makes its own molasses, unrefined sugar, herbs, and spices. The farm also features an herbal apothecary and a commercial kitchen. These are just a few reasons why the farm is the healthiest place on earth. To learn more about the healthiest place on earth, go to okefarm.com and use discount code BREEDLOVE for $21,000 off custom cabin pricing. Again, to learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and be sure to tell them I sent you. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. So we defined equity, though. And
Yeah, it sets everything up, though, to really understand these ideas.
So equality of outcome, approximately, which is also
the administered redistribution to achieve equality of outcome. That's super important.
The stealing to facilitate
That's
equality
right.
of outcome.
Equity starts with stealing.
Yes.
That's right.
And it's the destruction, obviously, of incentives to be productive, cooperative, even moral, let's say.
Right.
How does that, and we talked about how that, I mean, that is socialism, basically. How does that pertain to woke? So, like, and in your video, you just said, we said, what is woke? And you said it's something like Maoism with American characteristics.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. But how does it connect to equity? They aren't, but they are two separate topics. Mao's whole brand was like, we're going to give you bread and land. We're going to redistribute the land from the big landholders so that everybody has an equal parcel and so on. So equitable share of land holding. Right. So, but the idea within woke of equity is that our society is fully contoured. What woke means, if we're not being glib, is it means having critical consciousness. What critical consciousness means is that you have an awakened, hence woke, consciousness that power dynamics, structures of dominant power, create not just social, but also economic and even physical reality, or our interpretation thereof. In fact, it creates who you are. That's when Marx says that people are the product of their historical conditions. That's what he actually means. And so who people are is the result of these systems of power that are rooted in dominance and oppression. Marx says on the first page of the Communist Manifesto, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed. It's the conflict between those that defines the march of history. That's the first page, Communist Manifesto, first paragraph. And he actually says that it always either ends in revolutionary reconstitution of society or the common ruin of the contending classes.
Wow.
So it's always revolution or destruction is what happens with Marxism. And it's right there on page 1. But the idea is that these power dynamics benefit certain people more than others. It's not individual people's fault that they're not as productive as others. It's not even matters of accidents of birth. Like some people were born into wealthy families, or some people are born taller. You're taller than I am. Some people have better genes. They're good looking. They're fit. They can work longer hours, whatever it is. You know, they're not infirm, sickly constitutions, whatever it happens to be. And there's also these power dynamics, money, securing money against the poor people being able to get it from Marx. In other words, capital is isolating and insulating itself against being spread out to more people. Systemic racism exists to make sure that, as they phrase it, that white people have advantages in our Western Eurocentric, as they put it, societies, and that people of color are kept out. Like Joe Biden just said in his commencement address at Morehouse, he said to these black graduates, you have to work 10 times as hard as anybody else just to have a chance. And it's like, I don't think Joe Biden really believes that, but that's the
so 400-hour work weeks.
Yeah, apparently. You know, we joke about 8 days a week, but
that math doesn't math.
That doesn't math. So this idea is that these structures of power lock people out of an equal share. That's literally what Joe Biden just said.
Yeah.
So we know that he's in on this thinking. So equity is supposed to step in and say, well, the playing field itself isn't level, so we're going to move around how the playing field is shaped so that it's equal. The underlying assumption, though, is that every person is equal.
Right.
And then they point to stuff like the Declaration of Independence, as we believe that all men are created equal. Yeah, equal in political authority, which is that they have zero.
Right.
Or equal in their distance or relationship to God, is made in the image or whatever of the creator, nature's laws, and nature's God. Laws of nature care about all of us exactly the same amount.
Equal in the eyes of the law.
Yeah,
right? Or laws of physics or laws of the land.
And so as opposed to we're all the same.
Right.
But their fundamental assumption is this kind of perverse, hyper-egalitarian principle that really does come out of the French Revolution, that we're fundamentally equal. So when there's inequities, it must be the result of something unfair.
Right.
So we're just going to tweak the system, adjust the shares until it looks like it's fair. And so that's woke, is the belief that that's what you have to do. Anybody who's behind, or more particularly not anybody, not individuals, any demographic group that's behind, it's because of a structural inequality that keeps them down. So you have to jimmy the system so that on average, that social group is made closer to the others. I didn't say that it rises.
Right.
It's so that it's made closer. I mean, in some sense, maybe there's an up and a down at the same time. But a lot of times what it just means is, as I've phrased it for years, equity equalizes downward. It just means bringing those who are up down.
Of course. Okay, so this is terrible. This is an exact inversion, actually, right? Because this level playing field that this is premised upon, that would be private property or equality in the eyes of the law, right? Like one rule set that governs everyone.
Yeah.
Right? That is an actual level playing field on which, that's an equality that makes sense, basically, right? Like if you play a game, well, pick a sport, right? Basketball.
Yeah.
They don't change the rules game to game or player to player, right?
Well,
like
this is a good example, though, because think of golf, right? So you go out, everybody's angry at this tiny little ball that has to go 300 yards into a tiny little hole. Like, who thought of this? And anyway, as you know, golf can be very hard, but some people get very good at it. And some people, like Tiger Woods, appear to have magical talents that contribute to him becoming very good at the game. But there's also a concept in golf that's pretty common, at least, at the country club, maybe not on the tour, of a handicap, right? So their idea is that it's not how hard the guy worked to get better at golf. It has nothing to do with that. It's that, well, he was born a little taller, a little shorter, a little fatter, a little whatever. That's why the game doesn't come out equal. So we're going to calculate out the exact handicap for every single person, even if it's in real time, so that if the idea of equity applied to golf is that there's a handicap cooked into the game so that literally every golfer in every game of golf ever gets the same score.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure in professional golf they don't use handicaps.
No, they
right?
don't. No,
Exactly.
not in professional golf.
Exactly.
No, that's like you and the boys at the
Exactly.
But the concept is like
It's the same.
bowling and golf are the only two places I've ever
Right.
really heard people use it.
Which is like, okay, I sort of get that to like make it fun, like so you can play your daughter or whatever. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
like, okay, cool, but this is
that's
professional.
But it's an agreement between friends. It's not the operation of the world.
Works at the family level, not at
That's right.
professional level, right? Not in professional golf. They don't use handicaps
Right.
but they do compete under the same rule set.
Yeah.
Right. So there's like a level playing field in the sport, but then this ideology is in trying to change the playing field, make it uneven.
That's right.
To make outcomes even.
That's
right.
right.
So it's like a perfect inversion of what we actually want.
Right.
We actually want the playing field fixed and let the outcomes be uneven, because then
Right.
you can determine who's good at what, and we incentivize productive
That's
output.
exactly right.
Yeah.
That is exactly what you want. You want every single person who wants to be able to step on the field, and every single person plays by the exact same rules, shooting at the exact same goals,
Right.
and what they can achieve determines where they stand, what they're bringing to the game,
Yes.
I guess is a better way to say what it
Yes.
determines. That's what you're right. It's a perfect inversion.
So you also described this that I thought was very useful. Marxism as a genus,
That's what I wanted to communicate.
of which some of these small things, which you've already mentioned, CRT, quarter
Yep.
theory, et cetera, are species.
Yeah, if you wanted to ask me what was the point of your talk at the EU Parliament, it was that. It's that Marxism, first of all, I didn't push hard on this, but it's that it's this religious mentality.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual belief that human
Yeah.
beings are fundamentally social, and
Right.
we've been estranged from that, and we have to get back to it by destroying private property and everything that upholds it. And then I said, well, if you take a step back and you expand, as we started talking about, your concept of private property
Yeah.
or of capital, if you expand your concept of that to include these more abstract things, social capital, cultural capital. So it was true during Jim Crow, being white was massively advantageous in the United States. It wasn't physical capital in a sense. You couldn't go buy being white, but it was cultural capital. White people had this. And then, there's this persona cool that comes around, blues players or whatever. So now black people have this cultural capital, at least in a local economy, whatever it happens to be. You can imagine how the concept of cultural capital works. Well, they think that they understand the true historical development all the way through the past, but also to its intended future of, say, racial cultural capital, sexual cultural capital, blah, 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 all of them. And so what I said is, if you just take a step back and you think, okay, classical Marxism sees capital as bourgeois private property, and that's the problem that needs to be abolished. And there's a whole system called capitalism meant to uphold it, and that does all these terrible things. And then the people that are on the oppressed side of the dynamic it creates have to come together and seize the means of production of that form of capital, yada, yada. That's Marxism. Well, it's the same thing. Again, if you say, well, there's cultural capital attached to race, which they take way more seriously than most people do. Most people at least this kind of all really started to metastasize in the 90s. So most people by the 90s did not attach a ton of cultural capital anymore. We were on a track where that was becoming less and less relevant, more and more individual merits and character analysis. And they don't want that. They want it thought about in terms of each race has a reservoir of cultural
Class
capital.
consciousness.
And then all of a sudden you have this whole idea that, well, you have these people who are white, who have an advantage over people of color, and especially black people. They erect a doctrine of white supremacy that orders society. And the people that are done wrong by this, or that see that it's a moral abomination, need to awaken to their true consciousness of anti-racism and try to demolish the racist system. They don't have actual solutions. It's just everybody's supposed to become anti-racist, and then there will be no more racism. And then they say things very dichotomously, like you can either be racist or anti-racist. There's no in between. And they tell you what being an anti-racist means. It's a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism. So it's like, it's the same damn thing. It's race Marxism. All you have to do is step back and say that they're not, all the forms of capital for them are intertwined, but which one is the one at the surface? It's like, like a magic 8-ball. So imagine the magic 8-ball and all the little triangles say things like race, class, sex, gender, sexuality. And you're like, what's the biggest problem in society? And you shake it up and class floats up. Well, that's Marxism. And you shake it up again. What floats up is sex. And so then you have, feminism. But it's the same theory. It's the exact same idea, the exact same architecture. And so I said one way to think about that is that if you think of the way that I use the word Marxism is like a genus, like feline or whatever. Maybe that's an order or some, I'm not a biologist really, like no Ketanji Brown Jackson jokes here. I'm just not one. I don't know how it works out, but we'll just say it's feline or whatever, right? For cats. Panthera, I think, is actually a genus. And so there's different kinds of cats. There's different species of cats. We know a tiger and a house cat aren't the same thing, and a lion, something else, but they have lots of stuff in common. So when I say the word Marxism, I'm talking about this genus level understanding in the same way as if I said cats, you know that it could be a tiger, a house cat.
Right.
Lynx, whatever.
And so the species in that genus include, correct me if I'm wrong here, classical economic Marxism, as you said, critical race theory or critical theory more broadly.
Yes.
Queer theory, post-colonial theory, and feminism.
And more. There's disability studies. There, I believe it or not, there's fat studies. There's anything that you can imagine, basically, but as a matter of identity.
Right.
But those are the big ones.
Right.
Those are the really big ones. And it's just which form of abstract property is at the center.
Right.
Is it economic capital? Is it race? Is it sex? Is it sexuality? Is it, are you in a wheelchair or not? Ability status, as they call it.
And so one of the other things you brought up is that, and this is a core tenet of Marxism, we must seize the means of production to bring socialism to the world, right? That was the point.
Yeah.
But you went into depth about what means of production actually means.
Yeah, this is dark.
Yeah. So
super dark.
Could you expand a bit on that? Because it sounds like Marx was talking about much more than just capital per se.
It was. So Marx was not answering the question, how do we best organize society? It's very clear. He's answering the question is, who are human beings? What does it mean to be a human being? That's the question. And I just reiterate, that is a religious question, or at the very least, it's a deeply, deeply philosophical question. That's deep ontology or straight up religion.
Right.
And so the question he's asking is, who are we? What does it mean to be human? How do we become human? How do we become unhuman or anti-human? What are the forces? That's the question he's exploring. And what he lays out is this religion of an awakened enlightenment to socialism, but that's because you're actually awakening to who you really are on a spiritual level. You're socialist. And he says, well, what makes us who we are? And he's looking around, and I think there's this kind of narcissism to all of these philosophies or cults, really. And so it's, well, what did Marx want to avoid more than anything in the whole world? Getting a real job. So he's like, economic conditions make us who we are, because people like his mom, literally his mom, commented at one point and said, Karl writes an awful lot about capital. It'd be nice if he earned some, right? And there were people in his life, his wife, his Engels, even at certain times, like telling him, get a job, dude. Yeah. And he thought to himself, I'm so brilliant. I want to write my ideas, and I can't do that if I have a job. I'd be working for the man. I don't have, back then, maybe early industrial revolution, 60, 70 hours a week. I'm not going to have the energy to turn around and write my brilliant ideas about restructuring society. So the world owes me a living, so I can do this more productive, valuable religious work. And so when you look at it that way, that he's answering the question, who are we? His answer is, we are the product of his words are historical circumstances, or historical conditions, but what he means is economic conditions. The same idea extends to all the other ones. Our race is imposed upon people, and it creates, they call it structurally determines people's character, a total inversion of Martin Luther King that's in CRT, blah, blah, blah. So then he says, what is the mission? It's to seize the means of production. And you read Capital, it's very clear what he's talking about. He says you seize the means of production of the factories and the farms. Okay, so he does mean economic stuff. No, who people are as human beings is downstream from the economics. So what you're doing, you're not seizing the means of production of people, like putting their arms on for them. You're grabbing a hold of the way their soul is created, and you're controlling that. And he's really explicit about this. He says when you do activism, that's you doing your praxis on the world to change the world. But then the society itself, this historical conditions, he said something, I can't quite quote this one exactly from memory, but he says something like the history of man and his historical conditions or social conditions or whatever weighs upon the present generation like a nightmare or something like that. And I mean, it's actually worse than that, how he phrased it. But the idea is the society has generated who you are. It's made you who you are. However society is, you just conform to it. He called that the inversion of praxis. So what he was trying to do was seize the means of the production of a society. And when you change it and make it more socialist, all the people in it will just say, well, socialism is normal. It's good. It's how we live. And so the next generation will be more socialist. And then they'll do the next round of activity to change society so that society will socialize or brainwash them into accepting that that's the right way. And so his religion is actually that socialists alone are the ones who know true human nature, that we're socialists. And therefore, they're the only ones with the mandate to control literally the wheel of history as it turns, which when we finally get it right ends in communism. And so when he says seize the means of production, he means seize the means of production of society, which then in turn produces man, which will then in turn produce the next society, which will then in turn produce the next man. And we're back to the circular logic.
So seizing the means that produces humans, really, right?
Yeah,
or
it's eugenics.
The process of,
It's spiritual eugenics, though. It probably would do selective breeding and the kind of exoteric version of eugenics, but it's a spiritual eugenics, which is why it's totally okay for them to kill everybody who's not a socialist. They're getting rid of the spiritually inferior so that the rest of humanity can progress toward its destined endpoint.
Wow, that is indeed dark. How in the world, Marx was he was an alcoholic, I believe.
Yeah.
Didn't have a job. Or
unclean, wouldn't bathe. He thought bathing was bourgeois, had boils and warts and all kinds of like skin conditions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Prolific writer.
Very prolific writer. Let his kids die of exposure.
How did he, but wrong about a lot of things. Let's be clear about that. Like we mentioned, machinery does not increase productivity. Like that's blatantly wrong. Obviously, there's many other things in here that
humans
are
are not inherently socialist.
How did he propagate these ideas? Why have
the irony is he didn't. Not very well. He wrote, prolifically. He got chased out of Germany for being a rabble rouser. He did some actual activism too. He didn't just write. He was basically kind of like a low-level Antifa philosopher thug. He got chased out of Germany. He went to Paris. That's where he wrote that thing in 1844. It's called the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts. He got chased out of France, ends up in London. Well, the tolerant Brits didn't kick him out. He's buried in London. I visited his grave actually and pretended to pee on it. I have a standard. Like people got mad. They're like, "Why didn't you really pee on it?" I'm like, "I'm in public, man. I'm in public. I'm not just gonna whip it out and go." But anyway, I've got this iconic picture of me looking like I'm peeing on Marx's grave. But they didn't kick him out. But the thing is, his ideas did not catch on. He was not very successful. They were the short answer to how they were continued is secret societies. Okay. And this all gets sounds like tinfoil hat stuff, but it's all, you can look it all up. It's historical. There was this, kind of secret occult society is very famous in Europe called the Rosicrucians. They ended up having this kind of rival gang of, secret society. This is why it sounds funny. I'm telling you, they were really called the Illuminati. And the Illuminati was this French, German, mostly German, in that border area group that was opposed to the Rosicrucians, and they came up with this plot to kill the king and take over power. Turns out the courier, the guy running the message to the other group of them or whatever, gets hit by lightning on the way, dies. Everybody's spiritual, spooky, superstitious, so they think, can't touch the body. So the authorities actually get the body unspoiled, and it's got a charter of the membership and the plan to kill the king. So, well, they cracked down on that, didn't they? And so very few of them lived. They went off. The ones that did fled to France, and they got incorporated in this thing called the League of Just Men, or the Justice League, or something like this. And they were kind of precursors, or fellow travelers, I should say, really, with the Jacobins. So that's the same characters in the French Revolution. It's the leftists. And that the League of the Just eventually became called the Communist League, and they took up the communist philosophy. And the Communist League eventually paid Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto off of something he was already writing, which was called the Communist Confession of Faith. So it's a religion. Engels had him rename it, and they made it into the manifesto. But these secret societies that thought these might be useful for revolutionary activity, maybe it's, organic kind of Antifa type things. Yeah. Maybe it's, wealthy people who know that when they need to cause problems so they can have a coup, they know who to keep it going. Through the next, so Marx writes Capital in 1867 until 1917. So it's do the math, 60 years later, 50 years later. I'm a mathematician, I promise. 50 years later, Lenin puts Marx's ideas into practice with a twist, his so-called vanguard model, where there's now an enlightened bourgeois class that's going to overthrow, and then they're going to teach all the stupid peasants to become socialists instead of having the uprising from the bottom. And that's when communism became popular, because now you've had a humongous political revolution in a giant country that's massively industrializing very quickly, and that's a major force in World War I and World War II. And so that Marx was largely obscure, trafficked in dark corners of intellectual currents, until somebody got Lenin hopped up on it. And there are reasons why Lenin got hopped up on it. He's a psychopath in his own right, but the Tsar killed his brother, so he had a grudge. There's all this stuff that goes into it. And so until Lenin made it a force on the world stage, Marxism didn't really go anywhere. Marx would have been a footnote.
Was Lenin then using Marxism as like an implement to try to create, obviously he was a demagogue, I would assume would be an apt description for him. Was he trying to use that to create the state religion centered on him?
Yeah, probably. I think so.
Okay.
It was a very effective thing to go around to peasant societies, which is funny because it's not like what Marx said. It's the opposite of what Marx said. And tell them, I'll give you bread and land. And so it became a very effective campaign slogan, but for him and the Bolsheviks, to be able to gain peasant support and be able to overthrow the Tsar, who was not promising them bread and land.
Right.
And couldn't deliver it either. Wow.
Okay, so then to tie this back into wokeism a little bit, you have, I guess Marx was describing a bourgeois class that used a system of classism.
Yeah, classism.
To oppress the proletariat class.
Yeah, the upper class good, lower class bad.
Lower class bad.
Yeah.
Which is a very low resolution depiction of reality, by the way, because, obviously
it's super black and white.
Libertarians think in terms of acting individuals, which I think is very useful. But if you think in terms of classes, it's like you introduce all this arbitrariness, right?
You come back to it's a cult religion.
Right.
Where spiritually good, spiritually bad, the end.
Exactly.
Good versus evil.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you're just putting people in buckets arbitrarily, and then it's ripe for propaganda at that point. I love the definition of propaganda, that the purpose of propaganda is to make one group of humans forget that another group of humans is human, something like that.
Oh, that's a really good
so
one.
So you just put people in these buckets, and then you're like, oh, demonize, kill, destroy, whatever. So you have this class consciousness thing that Marxism creates to justify its acts of oppression, and it's identifying its enemy as capitalism, I guess.
Yeah.
Basically, okay.
Yeah, because Marx didn't want to get a job. I'm telling you, that's what it all comes down to.
That's crazy.
He didn't want to be productive. He wanted to be rewarded for the bullshit he was doing.
Right.
Actually, that's the disease at the heart of so many of these academics. They're doing something that's not actually productive to most people or very many people at all.
Right.
It doesn't justify the amount that A, they get paid off, and but B, the level of intellectual narcissism some of them have, that they're making the most important contribution to the world, and now it's not being rewarded. And so they flip out. And that's like the bug underneath.
Right.
The psychological bug underneath people like Marx. He wasn't being recognized for his genius.
It's crazy to think we're still dealing with one guy's reluctance to get a job so many centuries later. But I guess it was amplified by Lenin. And
it was intentionally amplified. Whether Lenin was put up to it or not, I don't know the history of that very detailed. I've heard that, I mean, we can get pretty conspiratorial on that.
Right.
That, you know, basically wealthy people in Europe thought it would be to the advantage to have an overthrow of the Tsar. And so they got Lenin hopped up on Marx and whipped up about his brother and sent him he was in Germany, and they sent him back to Russia. And then the Bolshevik Party came together and did what it did.
So then we have Marxist situation, one class is oppressing another class. And how does that, and so he's trying to stimulate the underclass to rise up and plunder / murder the upper class, right? Seize the means of productions, usher in the communist utopia, et cetera. How does that dynamic parallel what we see in these different species of modern Marxism?
It's exactly the same. It's literally exactly the same. They split the world into oppressor versus oppressed. They name the oppressor class as all bad, and it creates a dynamic or a power dynamic, literally is what they usually call it, a dominant power that oppresses everybody else. Their goal is to awaken as many of the dominant class as they can, but mostly the subordinated class, to awaken them to the fact that they are movers of history who just don't realize it, but the only way that they can have power, because they're not in the upper class, is to band together in solidarity and wage war on the system itself. You're not waging war on specific people. You're waging war on the form of the system itself in order to try to, in the wording they have, is liberate people from the unjust dynamic that they believe they're a part of. There is no oppressor or oppressed without a dynamic of oppression. And so you're not targeting specifically the oppressor, you're targeting oppression itself. So that's a raising of consciousness of the oppressed, and then that's an attack on all the mechanisms of society. And their goal is either to seize the means of production of whatever it is. So we're going to say what the terms of racial meaning are in CRT. So white people have all this guilt, they owe reparations, blah, blah, blah. And then with queer theory, we're going to determine what's acceptable, you know, not normal, but what's acceptable or valid as a presentation for people. If there's a man who wants to be a woman, that's valid. You have to leave it alone. Right? It doesn't matter if it's true. It doesn't matter if it's real. It's valid is the word that they give. And so they're going to seize the means of production of the range of acceptability for human behavior and presentation and even being, which at that point you're getting into some dark ontology again. And they're all the same. You know, the women are going to seize the means of production. Radical feminism, following Simone de Beauvoir from 1949, and the second sex, is women defining themselves as women absent the forces of patriarchy that are generated by men. So they're going to overthrow the system by seizing the means of production of the definition of woman. And that was what the whole point of the whole project is. And so it's the same thing again and again and again and again. But in practice, what that looks like is getting people filled with grievances and entitlement, get them mad, get them to back each other up as a political bloc, and then unleash them on their enemies.
Wow. The enemies that you identified for them.
Yes, of course.
So the reality, I mean, from my admittedly anarcho-capitalist viewpoint, is that if you're going to, I'm drawing this from Rothbard, if you really want to split the world into classes, there's basically the taxpayer and the tax consumer, right? Someone living off of the theft and someone being stolen from, essentially. Is this perhaps a means of obfuscating that reality? It's like getting people to be divided across other lines, whether that be some artificial class or race or sex or ideology, rather than looking at the reality of taxpayer versus tax consumer.
Certainly it is, but I think that the real base is that what they're looking for is a revolution, a revolt against the society. They want a coup is what they want. And so the goal is to find any reservoir of revolutionary energy and to stoke it to a hot fire. And so this is where this kind of species genus argument really comes in. It's hard to deliver in a Christian room sometimes because they get upset if you use the evolution thing. But different species of Marxism evolved different characteristics to deal with different social circumstances.
Right.
Economic Marxism was supposed to work on capitalism, and it doesn't.
Right.
But it works on peasant feudal societies like they had in Russia and in China
Right.
and in South Asia and some of the sort of in South America. In South America, they kind of evolved a new form that's sometimes called liberationism or third worldism. They use that in Vietnam. They used it across all of South America, but it's a different flavor. It's got this element of colonialism mixed in and this other dynamic. And then in the U.S., these things just didn't stick. So they went after identity politics that does. So you have the kind of leading neo-Marxist of the 60s, Herbert Marcuse. This guy's a rock star level influence, right? I mean, millions of books are selling. And the dude probably could have filled a stadium. He had huge following. He's considered the father of the new left. I mean, just outright. Huge following. So he's not a small, uninfluential character. And he explained, he said, the working class in an advanced capitalist society like the United States is not a basis for revolution. It's had its revolutionary potential stolen from it by advanced capitalism, is his argument, of course. But it's not a basis for revolution. So where, he says, is the vital energy to revolt against the very society and its form? He said it's in the ghetto populations. It's in the students. So we hop up the youth in the universities and we go to the racial ghettos, the sexual ghettos. We get the feminists involved. We get the mentally ill and prison populations involved. We get outsiders like immigrants involved. He even included military veterans, but as it turns out, that one didn't cut quite right. And basically, he said, we're going to use the students as a centerpiece to make a broad coalition of all these disparate outsiders who are not being served fully by the existing capitalist system. And it drew heavily off of the identity politics that Mao used. It drew explicitly, by the way, it drew heavily off of the liberationist model from the third world, where they're infusing capitalist and colonial critique, which had a lot of, native versus colonizer racial dynamics. And so he drew off of all of that. And that's why I really wanted to give that evolutionary model, is to see the conditions. The body politic, think of it like a living body, was not susceptible to the virus.
Right.
The virus could infect birds, but it couldn't make the leap to be a bird flu in Americans. This cultural Marxism that uses these various identity politics forms works in America. A cultural Marxism that uses colonialism works in South America and kind of in Europe and in Africa and in the post-colonized world, or even in the still colonized world. So it's different conditions work to get the exact same religious mentality into a revolutionary mass. So I don't think it's as sophisticated as that, except somebody's writing the checks, and it's probably not the Marxists. Except that Marxism is always this rich man's game. They're able to tap into rich people's guilt and get them to make a difference or whatever. But the fact is that there are people, I think, again, let me grab my tinfoil hat real quick just to put that on the table. I suspect that there are people even above the kind of wealthy upper class, whose kids are uprising at elite schools right now, that are much more in the line of what you're saying. They understand that they want to, say, break the American system because whatever objectives they have, they want to install some kind of a control mechanism or some kind of a basically slavery economy that they become the oligarchy or the monopoly masters of. And so economic and political power are the main things they're going for. But the American way is in the way. They need a coup. Yeah. They're not particularly hopped up on communism, but it works. And what it does in particular is it does obscure that line, and it shifts people who would naturally be banded together against, it's a mind-boggling phenomenon to sit down with a known dirtbag left guy today in his late 20s or 30s and listen to the guy talk about how great BlackRock is and talk about how great the pharmaceutical companies are. And it's like, you're on the left? Like, what's going on?
Another inversion.
But there should be these huge coalitions of people right now who are looking at stuff like BlackRock or at the Fed or at big pharma as a kind of a conglomerate and thinking, what the hell? You're the problem. Yeah. Especially pharma right now. People, I mean, there's 330 some odd million people in the U.S. There should be some of them are babies, so there should be 315 million fingers pointing. Yeah, right. But there are very savvy operators who know if you can get them yelling about racial injustice
Right.
instead, they go completely blind to the rest of it.
Right. Yeah, it's like it's a distraction, right? Like you're just getting that animosity directed at something else. I think too. Well, you said there that you would think there might be people another level up that are trying to engineer a crisis for whatever their agenda may be. Now, this is where I don't think this is actually conspiracy theory, but some people might say this. I often cite Marx's 1848 manifesto to the Communist Party. Measure number 5 says the state needs a central monopoly on cash and credit, basically, so the central bank to perpetrate or install Marxism.
Yep.
So central banking is Marxist money. I would not be surprised. I'm not that surprised to see cultural Marxism making its march through our social institutions, given that we have cultural Marxism literally built into the money, or at least Marxism built into the money. So perhaps the shareholders of those central banks are trying to engineer the good crisis that never goes to waste.
Right. So all of these different societies, we're about to take a left turn. All these different tyrannies are, in my opinion, and maybe this is a kind of novel theory. I don't talk about it a ton. So, and I think about it when I have time. So I'm probably leaving details out. Let's not call it a fully formed theory, but just as a benchmark, let's put that there are basically two forms to the tyranny. And they're both based off of the same model, which is the model given in Plato's Republic, where you have the philosopher kings who are like the gods, and then they have a layer below them that are their Praetorian Guard, and then you have a layer below them to do all the productive work. Then you have the hoi polloi down at the bottom. So that creates a pyramid of society, right? And the model that actually, the right name for that, given Plato's use of the term techne, is a technocracy. So it's a rule by the people who have the enlightened understanding of techne. So it's a technocracy, rule by experts. And my guess is that most of the people who fund Marxism are on the upright pyramid of Plato model. What Marx actually does is he takes the Plato model and flips it upside down. And so then the Marxists put themselves there. You ever notice how they say center this, center that, decenter this? We're going to decenter whiteness. We're going to center, alternative perspectives, indigenous perspectives, center, decenter. They move themselves to the center of the bottom of society, flip it over, and then what's going to happen? It's all going to fall, make a new junky pyramid, and they're on top. And so they become the new enlightened philosopher kings that are going to rule over. They install a Stasi or a KGB or Cheka or whatever to make sure that they have their layer of protection, a People's Liberation Army in China. Then they have all of the party functionaries who basically do everything. And then you have the masses. And so it's just the same model, but its actual kind of, natural law orientation is flipped over from the Platonic. And I think all the tyrannies are just these two triangles, these two pyramids of society, either upright or upside down. But it's the same model. It's the exact same concept, which, by the way, Plato also described in the term democracy. So you always hear them say, our democracy depends on apparently destroying all freedom. And Elon Musk, probably Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin bad for democracy? Do they say that?
I haven't heard that.
I'm sure they say it. Everything they don't like is bad for democracy.
Yeah, I'm
so
not sure.
I don't know. I haven't caught that
it's usually
one.
bad for the environment. That's the big one.
Well, that's part of the democracy, because the metabolic rift, of course. So anyway, it's the same model, though. So what it is both of them are technocratic models. That there's an enlightened technocratic class that gets to be in charge of everything. They're the stakeholders, so to speak. And they're going to speak for the masses, and they have their whole structure of society that makes them invincible. And my suspicion is that there are people already at kind of the top crust of our society. There's a weirdo group of people called evolutionary leaders out there that are affiliated vaguely with like kind of new agey stuff, but also the UN. They call them, and I quote, the hierarchy, which I think that might even be a Masonic term as well. The hierarchy runs everything, right? And so there's likely to be cough, royal family members and such that are extraordinarily high on the pile. And sometimes you need a little, neoliberalism. Sometimes you need a little communism. Sometimes you need a little fascism to shake things up and get it where you need it to be. But they just use these tools to manipulate society. So basically, if you want to go full conspiracy theory, so they can keep their global sex trafficking and drug trade going.
Yes. Oh man, I've heard of this. I like how you shake things up, because I'm thinking of the jar with the fire ants and the black ants.
Oh
in
yeah,
it, and you put them in there and they're fine.
Yeah.
But if you shake the jar, they'll all basically murder each other.
They'll kill each other.
So it's the ants obviously are mad at each other, but they should be mad at whoever's shaking the jar.
Right. So I suspect that's how this really works. I'm suspecting. I'm way out over my skis.
Right.
I'm more than happy if you have one to put a tinfoil hat on for this part of the interview. I'm putting my cards on the table, basically, though, honestly, about that.
No, that's fantastic.
But I think Marxism is therefore a tool. But I think that the Marxists who are bought into it, they buy it.
They believe it, right? Because those are almost like the functionaries in that hierarchy that are doing the work, so they need to believe.
Yeah.
And they need to drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're the ones that are going to be the party members that get everything done.
Right.
They're also going to be the most loyal and vicious of them will become the guard.
Right.
And then the elite can believe it or not believe it and futz around however they want, as long as they say the right thing in public.
So it sounds like we're describing ultimately that humans are hierarchical animals, and only we're more sophisticated in how we structure our hierarchies, and that we play these language games with one another, and that these are the iterations of the language game almost.
Now let's get Jordan Peterson down here to tell us about lobsters.
Yeah.
But no, it's true, because the language games get you to misunderstand the fundamental structure of a organic hierarchy.
Yes.
And Jordan Peterson, I didn't just bring him up to make the joke about lobsters. He has an it's one of the best points. I mean, he makes a lot of good points, but it's one of his best points that he makes, is he says that hierarchy is universal.
Of course.
And so the question is, how much corruption is in the hierarchy?
Yes.
And the answer is never zero. It would be great. I guess that's heaven, right?
Yeah.
There's no corruption in the hierarchy. God's at the top. The angels worship him. Everybody else worships. There's no such thing as a perfect
How do we
hierarchy
define
here.
corruption here?
That's a good question. Corruption would be, for Jordan Peterson, what it boils down to is corruption is a system in which people are rewarded for that which they did not contribute.
Got it. So like we were saying earlier, right? Yes.
So nepotism, for example, your kid, blah, 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 he didn't really contribute to the company, but maybe he's going to be the new CEO.
Right.
And, as they say, SOBs, sons of bosses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never getting rid of nepotism, that's for sure.
There's going to be these corruptions, but he says that the more meritocratic a system is, the lower its corruption.
Yes.
And so meritocracy is a system that is designed to minimize basically handing favors out to people who don't deserve them.
That's right.
Like maybe they've shown loyalty, maybe they have the same ideology or religion, maybe it's whatever. It's great if people have the same religion. It's not a problem, but it doesn't get anything done, not by itself.
Right.
It's still, what do you bring to the table? What can you do? That if you want a maximally successful, flourishing, prosperous society where well-being, standard of living, most importantly though, capacity to solve new problems.
Yes.
Where those things are maximized, you want the smallest amount of people basically getting paid for nothing or paid off or buddy system, old boys. You want the least of that possible.
Right.
And because you want problems solved and you want the capacity to solve problems, you want innovation to be at the front of what's going on. And that requires a meritocratic system, and that requires individualism and the capacity to profit off of taking risks.
And that requires strong private property.
That isn't possible without strong private property. It doesn't even, it's a non-starter.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Let me then.
My whole thing actually, by the way, is that you have two choices. You can build your, in the Bible, it's you can build your house on rock or on sand.
Yeah.
You have two choices if you're going to build a hierarchy. Either it's built on competence and merit, or it's built on corruption. So a definition for corruption could be, and it's kind of what I gave, I guess, is every single aspect of how you build out a hierarchy that's not earned.
So it'd be coercion. Right?
Coercion, for sure.
Right.
Or
it could be nepotism too, I guess.
Favoritism, all kinds of corruption.
But when it's not
coercion's one for sure.
When it's not directly rewarding productive output, then it falls into that second category.
Right. And productive, by the way, can be actually, I define it fairly broadly.
Yeah.
My definition of progress is fairly broad too. It's solving problems in the world, which could be kind of necessary things like, shelter, cleanup after disasters, protection, food, basic energy, stuff like that. But it could be something more abstract, like satisfying people's not just needs, but wants.
Yes. Yeah. This is the market. That's exactly how Mises describes the market process.
Yeah.
It's satisfying consumer wants, better, faster, cheaper, basically.
Yeah.
And that's the name of the game in capitalism, right? That's how you acquire wealth. That's the only way you acquire wealth because, I hate to say this, but like real capitalism, I don't want to say it's like, oh, we never had real socialism like we never had real capitalism, but we've actually never had real capitalism because we've always had property getting violated.
Yeah, right.
But in real capitalism, since you can't take people's stuff, the only thing you can do is satisfy their wants profitably. That's how you create wealth for yourself.
Right. If you want somebody's stuff, like I want some of your stuff or whatever, I have to demonstrate to you for some reason that you want to give me some of your stuff.
Yes.
And then you and I go into what's called a voluntary exchange.
Exactly.
I say, well, I have this stuff or this idea or this capacity to help you out. And you're like, well, I have these, wonderful bananas I grow or whatever. Yeah. And so here, let's have an exchange. And then we shake hands, which is the equivalent of a contract as far as when it gets more formal.
Yeah.
And we've entered into a contract to exchange goods and services because we think it's of mutual benefit.
Exactly.
If we are right in that guess, and every time we're right in that guess that it's of mutual benefit, that means both of us came out better than we were before, which means ships rise.
Right. That's right. Bingo. That's exactly the point. Let me ask you one more thing to try to tie this back to what we're talking about, and then we'll take a break. One of those species in the Marxist genus is critical race theory, CRT.
Yeah.
And as you said in the video, you could simply swap out class from Marxism and put in race, and bam, there you go. Critical race theory. It just falls right out of the hat, as you said. And CRT says whiteness must be abolished, similar to the way Marx advocated for the abolition of private property. Whiteness is considered to be this form of cultural capital or maybe cultural property. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
How and so there's the racism the ideology that Marxism was against was capitalism, but the ideology that critical race theory is arrayed against appears to be systemic. White supremacy. Yeah, right. That's right. Like saying being white is bad. How? Oh my gosh. I don't even know what to ask about this. It's so unbelievably bad. Like if you just swapped out whiteness and put in blackness, well then immediately people are like, oh no, that's bad. Or if you swapped out blackness and put in anything, right? Any minority, anything, people would say that's horrible.
Yeah,
yet somehow this is okay to say this about whiteness. Like what are we to do with this nonsense, and how is it that rational humans can adopt this? Like,
rational humans don't adopt this. Let's just cut through it. This is a religion of pathos, as I phrase it. So Christianity, John chapter 1, the Gospel of John, Christians get upset when I say this sometimes, but the Gospel of John is in fact the Christian manifesto. And so John chapter 1 lays out on a deep kind of ontological, philosophical level what Christianity is about. And it begins by saying, the Logos.
In the beginning was the Logos.
Yeah, which it translates in English usually as the Word.
Yeah.
And the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah.
Right. And then in John 1:18, the Word became flesh. So the Logos, the logical structure and comprehensibility of the universe came into being.
Yes.
Right. And then became flesh. We could say that, but it obviously is referring to Christ.
Yeah.
And that's Christian metaphysics, and that's not our domain right now. But the idea is that it's a religion based off of the idea of a logical structure in order comprehensible to reality itself, and that humans have some access to being able to do that. So I say, generally speaking, that Western civilization, which is derivative of Christianity in most regards without inverting anything, is a religion of logos. And that's straight out of John 1. It's extraordinarily well grounded. Even if you look at the idea coming out of the Greek, they were also interested. So some people like Ben Shapiro say it's Jerusalem and Athens. So that's the Jewish and Christian tradition in Jerusalem. And then you have Athens as this Greek rationality that was still in pursuit of understanding the logos. But they had these other modes as well. In addition to logos, there's pathos, which is kind of emotional, and then there's ethos, which is like ethical or moral dimension. And Marxism, fascism as well. Actually, Alexander Dugin, who's all in the news these days because of Putin, Alexander Dugin says explicitly in this essay he wrote called Fascism, Borderless and Red, that fascism is an expression of the pathos. And so I was like, wow, I was right. Okay, cool. Marxism is a religion of pathos. So rational people, by definition, are not taking this up. Emotional people are taking this up.
They can't be logos based because they're nonsense.
Their entire purpose, they're openly hostile to rationality and empiricism because it would stand in the way of their claim on the true nature of being.
Right.
It would fundamentally undermine their foundational claim. So they're openly hostile to it. And I mean openly hostile. They say that rationalism and empiricism are not just unjust applications of power, but are the fundamental corruptions that have ruined people.
This is where we get the 2 + 2 = 5 thing.
Yes, exactly.
Out of wokeism. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, because you have to open up the idea to other possibilities so that it's not so imposed that there's one right answer. So rational people don't take this up. People whose emotions have been stoked take this up. Mostly with Marxism, the emotions are envy and laziness. Entitlement is really the emotion there. With fascism, it's different. I think it's fear and despair that drive them. So then they want stability so bad they'll get a fake stability by forcing it. Communists want instability. They're not looking for stability at all because they have envy and despair. And it's like, Marx famously said, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, which is echoing Satan, because his idea was that if I can't have it, nobody should have it. Right? So they're destructive. But so it's not something rational people take up. It's something people who've had their emotions, their most primal emotions tweaked, take up. And how they lose the ability to see that, like you said, if we reverse it, whiteness to blackness or whatever, people say, holy crap, what is this?
Right.
It's like this, or whiteness for Jewishness.
Right.
You're like, whoa, that's the anti-Semitism of the Third Reich right there, because it literally is the same idea. It's the same exact
wording.
Conspiracy theory about hoarding power and excluding people. It's the same thing. And in fact, there's a book in CRT called How Jews Became White Folks and What That Means About Race in America by Karen Brodkin that makes that argument explicitly about Jews, that they made themselves white, claimed white status, and then became the cultural trendsetters of whiteness, So how they can't see it is their religious devotion, which is caught up in that pathological state, literally, of having been tweaked in negative emotion, negative affect. So rational people aren't picking it up. Now, as for whiteness being property in CRT, one of the foundational papers of CRT is titled Whiteness as Property. It's by a woman named Cheryl Harris from 1993, long legal article, and it talks about how, well, what are the properties of property? One of them is the fundamental right to exclude. She has 4. I don't remember what the other 3 that she lists are. But one of them is the fundamental right to exclude, right? And so I think there's something about fungibility or something like that. Somewhere in there, she makes the argument that white people erected a false universe, a false social reality of racial context and imposed it on everybody so they could exclude people from political and economic opportunity. And so it functions exactly like a form, in her own words, of bourgeois private property, which aligns it exactly with what Karl Marx says needs to be abolished in the Communist Manifesto. So this is a fundamental idea in its own words. This isn't me figuring stuff out. I just read their paper. Yeah. And then that proves, by the way, that it's race Marxism, but how do you see it in reality? You remember there was a big expose a couple of years ago. It's not just Coca-Cola, but Coca-Cola got it was like, hugely identified for this, that they had put on this huge training and that the goal of the training was to be less white. Wow. Is that abolish whiteness or what? And then they outlined, you can't change your skin color. That doesn't count. You can't be Rachel Dolezal and pretend. what does it mean? And it's like, well, here are all these cultural values you have to get away from. And the Smithsonian put out the cultural values of white supremacy. It's like punctuality, hard work. It's so like dark stereotypes. It's like, holy shit. What racist wrote this?
Oh
but
my God.
That's how they operate. And they fundamentally believe that values like hard work, work ethic and punctuality, emphasis of reason over emotion and so on. Those are characteristics of whites that whites ascribe to themselves and they kept other people out of. They use it to exclude people historically. So obviously they still do today because that's how their conspiracy theory works. And so whiteness is a form of private property that says, oh yeah, you're all these great things and people who don't have those characteristics, they're not so great. So we won't hire them. We won't give them opportunities. We won't give them legs up and so on. And that's literally CRT.
That is so crazy. Critical race theory then is aimed at fixing racism, but it is institutionalizing racism.
Yeah, that's right.
So
well, of course it is.
Another
because
inversion.
Marxists always do.
Right.
Because what we were saying before, it ties back to that, right? So we talked about how the government, does this and then they get people to hate each other and blame each other, right?
Yeah.
Well, how do you do that? Do happy people hate each other? No. Do comfortable people hate each other? No. You have to inject pain into the system.
Right.
And then you get the one group to blame the other group for the pain.
Right.
And then you tell the group that's being blamed that those people are trying to steal your stuff.
Right.
And then you have
it's the state doing the stealing.
That's right. Then
So
you
the
have
state does the stealing,
blast.
and then they say you did it.
That's right.
Right.
That's straight hate craft. And so in China, under Mao, for example, the party was the one ripping everything off.
Right.
Or under the Bolsheviks in USSR, Lenin and then Stalin were ripping everything off. They'd go raid houses to find propaganda and contraband, and they'd steal all the gold.
Right.
Just take it.
Who? Last question. We'll take a break. Who's funding the study you described there? I'm sorry, not the study. The paper, the 1993 paper, "Whiteness as Property." Who's funding stuff like that?
I don't know if that one had specific funding. I'd have to look at the end of it. They usually don't. Some of them do.
Okay.
But a lot of times, who's funding academic articles? Academia. These people have salaries. Their career incentives are to write papers.
Right.
So they have to write more papers. So they come up with ideas. They write papers. They don't get paid for the paper, but that's how their career advancement incentives work. And so Cheryl Harris was either a practicing attorney, but if she's writing a bunch of papers, she probably wasn't.
Right.
She's probably an academic lawyer. I'd have to look into her history. I'm just riffing. But that's the usual answer. You'll usually find if there's a conflict of interest statement or whatever that...
And behind academia, there is some state sponsoring, I assume, of some of this.
The state sponsors the hell out of academia.
Okay.
A lot of money goes into that. Other papers are given like National Science Foundation grants and other grants or whatever. But for the most part, a lot of this grew up in academia, and it was basically just the overwhelming sprawl of academia itself that was justifying being able to bring in this many activists and pay them salaries to write papers of this kind over decades. People don't realize, like, they started infiltrating academia very, very deliberately in the 1960s.
Right.
So we're way behind the curve. That like people are like, how did universities get so woke?
Right.
Well, let me tell you what happened. 50 something years ago, they started preferentially hiring their guys and preferentially pushing out everybody else, and then making a culture where nobody else wants to be there.
This is that video of the Russian guy, right?
Yeah, Yuri Bezdomov.
Yeah,
it's a generational strategy.
Yeah. So you've said that, I'm not sure if it's critical race theory or wokeism, the definition, or the description. You said that critical race theory or wokeism is calling everything you want to control oppressive until you control it.
Yeah. So that's a glib definition, but it's a good one. And I believe that. So woke is oppressive, woke, noun, I guess adjective or whatever, either way. Calling everything you want to control oppression until you control it. So you see something you want to control, it's an institution, it's a person, whatever. They're oppressing me, they're oppressing somebody, they're doing this, that's oppression, until you have it bend the knee and it's under your control. If you make that form of oppression be racism, then that's critical race theory. In my book, Race Marxism, which I wrote, I guess, I published it in 22, I wrote it in 21. the first sentence is that. I give 3 definitions, kind of in an increasing level of sophistication for critical race theory right there. Chapter 1, 3 definitions. And the first one is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. And it's shockingly useful. You look on, you look at social media, all the time, such and such is what, going to the park is white supremacy. Okay, so they want to control how people go to the park. It's just how they operate. So oppression is their dynamic, how the world works. And it's also their gateway to power, because their goal is to seize the means of production of things to undo oppression. They alone know how to do it. So yeah, that's what it is.
So then because that obviously would beg the question, what is the definition of oppression? But it sounds like they would just swap in any activity. Right?
Yeah, the definition really, there is real oppression. So let me make sure that people understand I'm talking about their worldview.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't write this down, obviously, but functionally, their worldview's definition of oppression would be not getting their way.
Right.
I'm not getting my way, I'm oppressed. It's the entitled toddler or entitled teenager definition of oppression. Oppression really is when there's, systematic attempt. I mean, Jim Crow was oppression.
Right.
That was unambiguously.
Yeah.
Slavery was oppression.
Yes.
Anywhere you had apartheid in South Africa was oppression, where you have this system set up to fundamentally and institutionally especially treat people differently, and in particular one group of people badly, probably based off of something arbitrary.
That's actually my favorite or most useful definition of corruption is the uneven application of rules, right? The whole rules for thee, not for me situation, which is apartheid, Jim Crow, everything you just described.
Or as Lenin said, I think it was Lenin that said this, it might be wrong, but I believe it was Lenin who said, for my enemies, the law, for my friends, everything.
Yes, exactly. So how can we defend against that if people just run around and no matter what you do, going to the park, they call it oppressive until they control the thing? Like, I'm reminded of Ayn Rand's quote. She said something like, definitions are the guardians of rationality.
Yeah.
But if the definition doesn't matter anymore. You're just calling every activity oppressive until you control the activity or the actor involved.
Yeah.
Or the means of production, whatever it may be. How can we, again, you said this doesn't appeal to rational people anyways, so we can't rationally defend against it. How are we supposed to defend against this?
So I'm pretty serious when I say that it's a magic trick or a magic spell that they're casting. I'm much more, I sound glib, but I'm very serious. That's what's happening.
Well, if it's a language game, and we get the term spelling, like casting spells, like it's with words.
Okay, so if I were a stage magician and I had my card trick here and I do my little thing and show you the Queen of Hearts, and then I do my little thing, and the next thing you know, I pop out a $20 bill and you're like, whoa. And I'm like, open your wallet. And there's no $20 bill anymore, but there's the Queen of Hearts. And maybe, you don't know how that happened, right? That's a magic trick, right? That's a spell in a sense. What I've done is I've manipulated your perception of what's going on in reality. I've manipulated, let me emphasize, your perception of reality such that you didn't see the causal act that swapped out whatever. I don't know how in the world such a trick would be done, but maybe David Blaine could do that or something. Some of these guys. But the point is that the second you see how the trick is done, it's not, whoa, the awe is gone, right? So if I showed you, look, I just had it folded up or whatever behind my hand, or you're like, oh, right? So if you ever watch, there's lots of these on Instagram. It's really popular where people show you the magic trick from the magician's perspective and you can see how they do it. There's still skill involved. It's like, some of this stuff's hard to do with your hands or your fingers or to set things up.
But the magic's gone.
But the magic is gone. Because the definition of magic from the illusionist perspective actually is, or even just the definition of magic at all, is that when you have cause A and effect B with no causal relationship determinable between them. So that's magic, right? Well, once you know the causal mechanism in between what happened, now you're in a completely different paradigm. There's no magic, there's no awe, there's no shock. So what does that have to do with anything? Calling everything you want to control racist, you can say that's not racist, but now you're playing into this argument of whether or not it is. Turns out this actually plays into a force or a power or whatever that's called social reification. You kind of make it real by participating. The way that you actually do it is you show people the magic trick. You say they're just calling you racist so they can control you, so they can make you do what they want. And all of a sudden it snaps people out. It doesn't always work. It's not like a silver bullet. Nothing's a silver bullet with this stuff. But the trick to overcoming these tactics is actually naming the dynamic. So when I say the definition of woke is to call everything they want to control oppression until they control it, that breaks the spell. And every time somebody encounters it, there's a chance they're gonna see how the magic trick works. When they see that, it's not that the word loses its meaning, it's that the word loses its illegitimate power, which is completely different. It losing its meaning, I was really afraid racism would lose its meaning because of these people, but that's actually not what's happened.
Wow.
That has not happened in our society. We have not lost the meaning of racism. I have met almost nobody who now thinks racism's okay or it's on the table. What I've found instead is people who say things like, I know what racism means and they don't. And they can't use that against me anymore. So it's not racism doesn't mean anything anymore.
Sure.
It's you called me a name, like Conor McGregor when he stood up for Ireland. He said, call it whatever you want. I don't care. He's not saying it's okay to be racist.
Yeah.
He's saying your magic word doesn't have power over me anymore.
Right.
And when people understand that it's a manipulative trick,
Yes.
that there's this real meaning lurking somewhere down there, and we all still know it, but there's this magic trick, they lose their power.
Well, then you click back into the domain of rationality, because once there's a social consensus on the meaning of the term, well, then all of a sudden when it's used improperly, you're like, well, you're just stupid. You're just using the word improperly.
Yeah, that's right.
The term social reification, that's interesting. Reminds me of the Thomas theorem, which is something like, if man acts as if a thing is real, then it becomes real, sort of thing. Like we like social consensus, right? Like things money, the calendar, nation states, human rights. Like we pretend these things into existence, basically. And so that is interesting. Like fiat currency occurs to me as like this social reification. If we would all just realize it's an illusion, then we could stop the scam. Yeah. That's fascinating framing on that. I'd like to thank my friends at Swan Bitcoin for their long-standing support of the What is Money show. Swan's mission is to help millions of people get into Bitcoin, so they built the best solution to set up recurring Bitcoin buys and automatic withdrawals into cold storage. With the Swan app, it takes just 2 minutes to sign up and start buying Bitcoin. If you're a new customer, you get $10 in free Bitcoin for signing up, and the first $10,000 of Bitcoin you buy incurs 0 fees. If you're an existing Swan customer, then the next $10,000 of Bitcoin you buy now incurs 0 fees. So if you love to recommend Bitcoin to friends and family, then Swan is the best place to start. So go to swanbitcoin.com/breedlove to get started today. Again, that's swanbitcoin.com/breedlove. Are you sick of being robbed by politicians through inflation and endless money printing? If so, you need to be at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville, Tennessee on July 25th through 27th. As the largest Bitcoin and Fintech conference in the world, Bitcoin 2024 stands as a beacon of monetary freedom, a glimmer of hope amongst a darkening macroeconomic backdrop. Top speakers, companies, and thought leaders from across the industry will convene in Nashville to look ahead to the next year and beyond. I will be there, and Bitcoin conferences like this have become my favorite place to socialize since becoming a Bitcoiner. Ticket prices will increase soon. Get your tickets now and secure your spot at this game-changing event. So go to b.tc/conference and use discount code BREEDLOVE to sign up for the Bitcoin 2024 conference. Again, that's b.tc/conference, discount code BREEDLOVE. So then the battle is showing people the magic trick to get them to not be hijacked by pathos, which is what this thing is dependent on, and get them back into logos, essentially.
Right. It's like there's another magic trick they pull a lot, which they have it in they have a activist guide people should read. It's called Beautiful Trouble. You can look it up on the internet, beautifultrouble.org. It's there. And you can read their tactics. And you're like, holy shit, that's what they do. Like that's when you read through it, you're like, holy shit, this is what they do. And so they have this tactic that's called play to the audience that isn't there, right? They have another one that's called your target's reaction is your real action. They have another one that's escalate strategically. So you take those, so just those three, you put them together. What do? They go out and they're, say, on a campus and they have their encampment and they're doing their stupid, screaming whatever. And they're provoking the other people who are around. And they have a dozen people around there with their phone cameras ready to go, and they film it. Another one is do the media's work for them. And so let's say that they're sitting there and they're calling some, say, for the present context, some Jewish kid, some name, and the Jewish kid like gets mad and pushes them. So what happens is somebody films it. The part where the name is being called never makes the film. The part where the Jewish kid just walks up and pushes some guy he's mad at, that goes on camera. Next thing you know, somebody sends it to a journalist at CNN. Look how violent the counter protest is. I personally don't know what's going on with the Proud Boys, but I'm positive they use this technique on the Proud Boys over and over and over and over again, so that they become a thing that the now Department of Justice treats as an extremist group, right? And so they've ginned up this idea by taking, so this is a different magic spell. They take the thing out of context so that they provoke and then they show the reaction to the provocation. So how do you get around that one? You show the provocation. You get people to realize the fuller context. Right.
This is the same thing in finance. They call it cherry picking.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll throw a headline on and be like, oh, Bitcoin's down 50%. It's like over like the past 6 months that you cherry picked. And then if you go out 12 months, it's up 1,000%,
so like
whatever it is.
You find the window in which it's doing what it needs to be doing to make the story. So this is actually the George Soros method. I don't know if you knew we were going to go George Soros on this. But
I didn't know that, but let's go.
Have you read Alchemy of Finance and its concept of reflexivity?
I know reflexivity, yes.
Yeah, so reflexivity is this idea that reality and perception are combined together. But what he talks about is actually the capacity to generate feedback loops.
Yes.
So if you cherry pick, you tell this particular manicured lie, say about Bitcoin, it could be about anything in the market. That's what George Soros did, or a currency, or the quality of a nation. Yeah, the British pound, very famously. You can get people to believe that an asset is undervalued or overvalued. But what happens is there's this feedback loop of behavior. People believe an asset is, let's say, overvalued. Some people start to short it and some people start to sell it. And then what happens is you get a self-fulfilling prophecy. People claim it's overvalued, so people freak out and they sell. Now it is overvalued because the market price is supposed to fall because people are selling. And boom, you made it come into reality. And his method to manipulate markets or currencies or countries is to do that, to get people to believe an asset. Usually for him, he says in Alchemy of Finance that his malicious pleasure, that's how he phrases it. He takes a malicious pleasure in short selling institutional favorites. So people ask me all the time, what's his motivation against the United States? It's an institutional favorite. And if you want to short sell the United States, what would you do? You're going to get it bloated with debt. You're going to get it burdened with social programs, and you're going to overload it with things like immigrants and crime. And you're going to make all the young people believe that it's a crappy country that they shouldn't believe in for their future. What does George Soros throw money at in the U.S.? All those things. So now what? Is the U.S. an overvalued asset? That's the question. That's what BRICS is about and this whole thing.
Right.
And so that was manipulated into that. I mean, some of it may have been organic and for other reasons, the fiat currency problems and the Fed, but some of it was manipulated into position on purpose.
Right.
And I'm not talking specifically about just our currency. I'm talking about the U.S. as a political entity as well. It's a more abstract use of institutional favorite and value and all that. But this is his game. So he mostly played the short sell aspect of it, but you could have the other side too. You could convince people that an asset's vastly undervalued, and wasn't that what they did with GameStop? And then all these people bought into it really quickly or whatever. And then is that how that worked? No, they short. Yeah, because there were a bunch of people shorting it.
Yeah, so Wall Street hedge funds were shorting it, as I understand. So then retail investors bought it and created a short squeeze.
That's right, a short squeeze. That's what it's called. It's been a while.
Yeah.
So you can play it either way, but that's not the same because they weren't. What Soros does is he massages the media environment to make there be a belief in a particular, trend that's not quite happening yet
Right.
until the trend takes off. But this is the same thing that the woke are doing.
Yes.
They're massaging the
right.
circumstances until people think, whoa, maybe the cops really are racist.
Yes.
And then boom, there's an institutional collapse of the police.
Yes. Wow. It's that seems to be the game that's being played when you're describing all these hierarchies competing to decide which
This
one.
is the big game. Soros says in Alchemy of Finance, which he published in 92, in the late 80s, he took it over to the CCP in China, and they were so in love with it. They adopted the whole program. That's how they do all of their, we could call it, if they're doing it to us, political warfare tactics. And the reason they loved it is because it gave them tools that were rooted in Marxism that allowed them to transcend Marx to a quasi-market
Wow.
arena.
Wow.
And so that is the game. That's why when Trump got elected, it was Trump derangement syndrome 24/7 on CNN, was to create a panic that became a self-fulfilling prophecy of, freaking out about Trump and now he's going to be a dictator. And if they could have pinned him into doing something dictatorial, boom, they would have had him.
Right. Yeah, and this gets back to the whole fractal concept because it's an as above, so below thing, right? If you can get individuals to believe that an asset is overvalued, therefore they will sell it, and they'll express that belief through selling the thing down, ultimately making it overvalued. Then you get this public psychology or collective psychology outcome that, well, the thing's actually overvalued in the marketplace, right? Like it's oversold or whatever, however you want to put this. And so then we're always, this is the fundamental human battle is that we're, this is why Plato said, right? Those who tell stories rule society. It's whoever is controlling
the narrative.
The
space.
narrative, but the narrative becomes reflected in actuality.
And people's beliefs, right.
Yeah.
Soros says that the movement of history exists in the gap between reality and the perception of reality.
Right.
So you get people to believe something is happening. This is a revolutionary moment.
Yes.
Or whatever. And if enough people believe it, it becomes real.
Right. That is social reification then.
Well, that's the reflexive process. But when it becomes real, that's social reification. Yeah.
And then what was the quote where... this is George Orwell, right? He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. Is that how that goes?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that the same thing? He's basically saying if you control the present, you can say what happened in the past.
That's right.
If you can say what happened in the past, you can say where you're going in the future. Something like that.
That's right. And so they take...
This is all mythology, basically. We're
It's exactly what it
creatures.
is. They are weaving vast social mythologies about the workings of civilization that are all extraordinarily self-serving. And then what's their narrative? The other ones are all actually self-serving, and we're saving you from that.
Right.
Right? Capitalism is self-serving. People are selfish.
Yes.
And we're going to rescue you from that. But as a matter of fact, they're starting at their end point, which is that we're socialist beings, and then they create an entire social mythology. You know what social mythology really, the word is that means social mythology? It's ideology.
Right.
An ideology is a social mythology.
Right.
And that's what they're doing. And these things are properly deranging.
Right. And the hallmark of an ideology is something like a set of propositions that encapsulate the totality of reality, right? Like we've got all the answers.
That's right.
All the answers.
That's right.
Rather than like the Christian religion be like, love God. It's something like be humble, right? Like you're not going to know everything.
Yeah.
There's a lot you can't
got really
know.
one thing to do here.
Yeah, exactly. Love God and love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yeah, too. That's right.
Yeah.
That's the gospel.
That is so interesting. So if that is what humans are doing, if this mythological battle, man, this is complicated because then you have to get, all right, here's a question then. What's the difference then between, say, a religion and these pseudo-religious ideologies?
Not much in many regards. But for me, a religion is really dedicated. Religion actually, I think, is properly not as interested in the political sphere. First of all, it's not.
Right.
It's focused on theological matters ahead of, kind of worldly or practical matters, and it's really about the development of the individuals within them. You even see that in religions like Buddhism and everything else.
Yeah.
So I think that there's this thing. I told Joe Rogan a couple of years ago, I was on a show, and I said, it's like you have these religions that in some sense is like they're religions are like pointed upwards. Their eyes are on God and they're aware of sin.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, these things are like religions that are pointed downward, right? All they think about is the sin of everybody else, and they're God somewhere out there, right?
Or they're the God. Typically.
Well, that is
Yeah,
typically actually
yeah.
it. With Marx, it's literal. The humans are the creator of humans. We're our own.
Yeah.
He says that we're to make ourselves our own true sun that revolves around itself.
Right. And so then there's this weird battle where each ideology, pseudo-religious ideology, is trying to position itself as the answer. All of the other ones are bad, but we are good. We have the right answer. And so that's fueling this battle to, I guess, recruit people into these different hierarchies, basically.
Right. And all of them have the same cult belief structure, which is that it works when enough people believe it.
Social reification.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Reality becomes whatever we want it to be when enough people will believe whatever we say.
Okay. Libertarianism is accused of the same thing, but I would say that it's actually advocating for the truth. It's saying like the individual owns themselves, life, liberty, property, leave people alone. It actually is the right one.
Yeah, libertarianism or classical liberalism, however you want to phrase it, is in fact a very minimalist set of assumptions.
Yeah.
So it's not got a lot. In fact, it doesn't tell you anything about what you have to believe. It doesn't even tell you you have to be one. It doesn't even tell you have to participate in the system. So it's got this very minimal set of assumptions. What are they? Well, it's like, well, we're not God. That's one.
Yeah.
So we have limited political authority. Maybe, in fact, the answer is that we have no intrinsic political authority.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we're all created equal. Okay, fine. And that there are certain what we consider to be, inalienable truths, there's certain self-evident truths about our inalienable rights to things like life, liberty, and property, which that's a pretty minimal list of things.
Yeah.
Right? Like, look at these people with the human rights discourses. They don't list life, liberty, property. They've got pages and pages of medicine, having your student loans paid for. These are human rights. Trans rights are human rights. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
It's like, holy smokes. Their list is very long. This is minimal. It's like, no, we're going to keep people out of your affairs of life, liberty, and property.
Right.
And beyond that, kind of, you're on your own, kid. But we're going to do that to make sure, as you said, that we're going to defer away from violence to adjudicate dispute.
Right.
Whether that dispute's about belief, whether it disputes about property.
Is libertarianism not selling as well because it's not promising people free shit like all these other ideologies?
I have deeper suspicions about it. So do you know Stephen Hicks? I encourage people to look up Stephen Hicks if they don't know him. Stephen's great. Stephen and I had a dinner last November, and we're talking, and Stephen said something truly profound to me, which is he said, because we were talking about this, really. And he said, well, there's no, philosophically speaking, and I don't know anybody, he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of philosophy. It's just frightening. I hope he sees this. This man can sit here and you can say, well, what do you think about X? And you can see him writing the outline in his head, and it's like he just rattles off a chapter of a book to you in detailed fashion. But he says that in 150 years or so since John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill's not exactly like this powerhouse on the issue. There's been the closest we have is Ayn Rand, who primarily wrote novels.
Yeah.
I mean, they convey philosophical ideas, but she wrote novels. Right. So we've had no philosopher articulating and defending the very concept of an individual. Mm-hmm. So how can you have a philosophy based on self-government and individual rights if people have lost what it means to be an individual? The relationship between the individual and the collective has been tipped very vigorously through progressivism, through Marxism, through fascism, through other ideologies, through idealism, Neoplatonism, into these concepts of the individual's not really an individual, or as Barack Obama put it, you didn't build that. So we have no robust philosophical definition. And he has this whole articulation. I can't repeat it. He's such a genius. He just goes down and he's like, well, you have the philosophical basis, and then this happens and this happens. And it's about 100 years later, you start to see whatever the prevailing philosophy is starts to really define society. And he says it's been about 150 years since we've had a robust defense, 170 if it's Mill, really, robust defense of what an individual is. So how can you have libertarianism or whatever, how can you have a philosophy of organizing society, a political philosophy based on the individual if you don't know what the individual is?
Right.
I think there's another force, and I think it's extremely important, and you're kind of in that space, right? Which is technology has progressed to a way where some of the answers to the questions around the individual are not clear, or not as crystal clear as they were when they were written down, say, in our Constitution. What do I mean? They actually put a provision in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, if I'm not mistaken, to the powers of Congress about intellectual property. Yeah. But think about how freaking, just like pause for a second about how abstract that is. And they say it's to encourage the sciences, the development of the sciences and something else in order to, they want to protect for a period of time, so Congress has the power to protect intellectual property rights for a period of time. And that's a mind blower, right? Like I wrote something down on a piece of paper and you read the thing and the idea successfully transferred into your mind, which was the point of me writing it down. So now it's your thought too. It becomes shared intentionality and it made it into your head. And then you go articulate it. And in some sense, if it's something that I could have turned profit off of, I could, in a sense, sue you for violating intellectual property. That's freaking out there, right? But now take it another level, digital property. I might blow your mind on this one a little bit, but I know in your space that you're in with Bitcoin, it's on another level. But okay, so here's this device, right? And you have one right there. You're just using it. We all use these every day. So one of the things in this is a camera. So I take a picture with my camera. Maybe it looks really good. I'm thinking, dang, nailed it. So I decide to get a print and I decide to start selling it and I put it on the internet and you can buy the print. If I take a photograph with this device, I own the intellectual property to that photograph. You can't steal my picture. Okay, fine. What if I type a text message and Google Keyboard, it happens to not be an Apple, Google Keyboard traces everything that I type. Or I go on Twitter and I interact, right? And the algorithm keeps track of what I look at, what I see. We all know if I'm going to talk about some product or whatever, it's going to see the water bottle, and now I'm going to have ads for the water bottle later in my Instagram. We all know it's going to do that. I don't own that data. Same device, same user. With the camera, user-generated data is my intellectual property. But if I type a message and the keyboard records it and hands it off and sells it as third-party data to spy on me or whatever, I don't own that data. Same device, same user, same process. Isn't that fascinating? If I make a meme, I mean, it's like a running joke on the internet. Do I own the meme? Can anybody own a meme? How do you own a meme? But I can put that on Twitter. Twitter pays me to tweet now, right? I have the verified account, the whole thing. I make money off of it. So if somebody steals my meme, I might actually lose economic utility. But imagine me going and trying to you stole my meme. You'd get mocked relentlessly and rightly so, right? There's this gray area with property now. In digital property. Do I own a digital photo? Apparently. But if I use the same device to generate text, do I own the text? Well, if I'm writing it as a, piece of an article or whatever, yes. But if it's just data being collected or metadata being collected for my browsing habits, no. That's some gray area. Like who owns what and why? When is it user-generated data is owned and when is it device-generated data is owned elsewhere? Owner of the device or user of the device versus manufacturer of the device. This spreads into real life. Tractors have high tech to read soil and all this, John Deere tractors. Well, John Deere owns the data that those tractors develop and they sell it to futures traders. Make buku bucks, but guess what? The future traders then bet against the farmers that are generating the data who don't even own the data. This is a real problem. But who owns that? John Deere, because it's their tractor and their technology, or the farmer who actually drove the tractor and generated it? So until we can clarify, how do we secure property, right? And this is why it's way in your space. How do we secure an inalienable right to property, supposing we can even agree that that's a philosophical priority, and I think we should, if we can't define property clearly yet? Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I mean, so libertarians would actually argue, true libertarians would say intellectual property is a farce. Because it's non-scarce and it's non-rivalrous. So like you said, you tell me an idea,
Well, my use of that idea doesn't diminish your use of the idea. Now, if you hand me your shovel and I use your shovel, well, that does diminish your use of the shovel, right? You can exclude people from the use of the shovel, but you can't exclude people in the same way from the use of an idea.
Right, with the idea. But if I publish a book and you just copy my book and publish the book too, it's...
Exactly. I know. And this is the libertarian argument, is that you have to find different ways to monetize that. Or, I mean, you could still like...
Right, because that became huge with the whole Napster debate with...
Exactly.
Yeah, with Metallica.
But I think we're headed towards that world where that philosophical debate just gets resolved in the market, right? It's like,
sure,
it's not going to matter anymore whether you think you should own your data or not own it. Like, there's just going to be ways that things, you either secure it and encrypt it or you don't. If it gets out, then you're screwed.
So I think but to answer your question, I think there are fundamental issues about even selling liberty because people don't even know what it represents.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, there's the classic, there's the binary, the liberty versus security.
Right.
And there's a lot of stuff. It changes very fast. People are, in a sense, kind of scared shitless.
Yeah.
And when they're scared, they want security.
Yeah.
And how do you buy security? You trade liberty.
Right.
And so libertarianism, if it wants to be relevant... Does it have to
be that way? Does it have to be that way?
I'm not 100% sure, but it's commonly what happens.
If we collectivize security, you have to go up some
For sure. So libertarians are I have not heard, back in like 1776, it was the cause of liberty, right? And there's this kind of passionate, I get to self-determine, I get to, own my own stuff and do with it as I want to. This is a movement and no king is going to tell me what to do. And that all just seems like kind of old-fashioned and whatnot now. And there's just not this articulation of what it brings to the table. Frankly, also, I think a lot of the basis, and a lot of libertarians are probably going to cringe, I think a lot of the basis for the classical liberal program, even though the classical liberal program is by definition secular, is a Christian motivation.
Absolutely.
The motivation that led Locke to these principles was that the state, nobody else, but in particular the state, has no standing, no authority upon which it can interfere with the human being's relationship to God.
Right.
Because if the state's wrong, that's an unbelievable evil that's occurring. I mean, it's an infinite evil that's occurring. So his idea was that the state cannot be interfering in that whatsoever. Yeah. But I don't hear this articulation that religious liberty depends on this, and that the securing of property, the securing of, and which means answering the questions about digital property and intellectual property, the securing of liberty and life are necessary to your relationship with God. Yeah. And I don't hear Christians articulating that is the basis of the individualism of our society in many regards too. Because in Christianity, and this is pretty unique among religions, I mean, Buddhism has similar stuff in its own way. It is your relationship, your acceptance or denial of the grace extended to you through the promise of the gospel, yours, that determines whether or not you're saved. Now, this isn't even the case necessarily with Catholics all the time. The church can save you as long as you kind of do the stuff. You stay good with the church, which is your decision to stay good with the church. But in Protestant Christianity, it's straight up something completely. Did I accept Jesus in my heart? Yes or no? Right? That's it. Is he my savior? Yes or no? That's it. And so nothing can interfere with that is a key thing. But the Christians aren't articulating what is an individual. An individual is the only thing that has the capacity to accept or deny the grace extended to it, say by the promise of the gospel. The individual, I mean, we could do that, and we could do it in secular ways too, but I don't hear these articulations that give this kind of inspiring, why are we so interested in that? Right. But what I do hear constantly is, here's this bad thing in the world, so we need to coordinate to stop the bad thing from getting it. So we get collective security demands being articulated constantly. Yeah. And so young people, scared people, whatever, hear those and they think, damn, I don't want to get a virus. Do what you're supposed to do, I don't want to get sick. Right. And if there's no articulation of you're losing fundamentally who you are if you go along with it, that I think is why libertarians aren't able to sell their philosophy.
Yeah, man, that's a tough one. It's because those people.
And I'm
that
not
are
good at it either. I'm just saying.
No, I hear you, and I don't consider myself great at it either. But damn, I'm trying. That the person that's scared of getting the virus, and they're like, oh, just do what you're supposed to do what you're told, right, to keep from getting the virus. Like, that's based on this presupposition that whoever's telling you what to do is like has your best interest in mind, which is
right, which they will never
flawed,
for long.
Of course, right.
Yeah, the benevolent emperor. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, right.
And there's this whole thing called the bad emperor problem,
right,
which is as soon as you sign up for the benevolent emperor, you're guaranteed the bad one.
Exactly.
As soon as you sign up for whoever, you're getting Nero.
Yeah, and then even if, yeah, exactly, you're going to get the bad one at some point, and then they're. The other thing is they people would believe they're getting free things from this, right? So it's like, oh, what do you mean? I don't have to do anything. I get a free whatever, free shelter, free car, free welfare check, free this, free that. But
which comes back to them being in fundamental misunderstanding about how things work. Because
it's not free. It's never free. But you can then induce the non-productive group to then support the ideology.
Yeah.
By incentivizing them with the fruits stolen from the productive group.
I just read this, and
libertarianism can't offer that, so it's hard.
No, that's right.
You know?
It fundamentally is saying that life is harder in some ways, but responsibility is better.
Yes.
Being able to take responsibility, being able to do stuff is actually better, more fulfilling, cooler, if we want to use more modern language, than having to rely on the government or having to rely on somebody's mom or Fritter Bingles to cut you a check, or whatever. I think we instinctively gravitate toward that.
Yes.
But when it's the promise of free stuff, which is just another form of security, or apparently free stuff, it's hard. It's a hard sell when people don't understand how things work.
Here's the real insidious part. It's getting to me now. Because those people that are being dispossessed economically under the rubric of statism, right? Yeah. They're suffering because the state is stealing from people largely, right? That's creating more poverty. But then they're getting these free handouts. But in a world of libertarianism, they probably wouldn't be as poor, right? Or maybe they'd still be at the bottom, but the bottom would be higher, right?
Yeah.
Because there'd be more economic prosperity in general because there'd be a lower level of systematic theft. And so it's a very vicious cycle. It's like you're stealing from people, but then you're rewarding enough people to support the ideology, which makes the real ideology of libertarianism that would, rise all tides harder to sell.
Right.
Because there's not free shit to give out to cover up the economic dispossession, if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. And encouraging a larger number of people to take the apparent hit of responsibility and then seeing that things get better is kind of the positive feedback loop that can amend that. But you have to get people to believe it first. Right. I just read something also the other day, and it's probably like Thomas Sowell or somebody, and I saw it on Twitter, so I don't remember what the quote was attributed to. But it said, and maybe it's just some guy's tweet, and I'm embarrassing myself to whoever it is, but credit wherever it goes. The idea was that kind of low-functioning people prefer authoritarian systems because something they can compete at. They're not good at producing, but they can compete at obedience.
Yes, right.
And show how obedient they are and I hear that sentiment. I've heard it in China. I've been to China. I've talked to people, and I've heard people there in China say explicitly, a lot of us, probably half, just like to be told what to do. It's less to think about. And then I had a conversation with a friend of mine from grad school one day, after we were out of school, maybe a few years later, 2013, 14, something like that. And he told me, we got talking about feminism, and he was upset with me because I wasn't super pro-feminist. And he said that he said, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, I look forward to the day that our feminist overlords are in control. And I said, what are you talking about? Why? And he said, because if they're telling me what to do, it's just one less thing for me to think about. Therefore, men can just do things without having to think about what they're going to do. And I was thinking, how can you not see how that goes wrong, right? Like, that's all well and good, I guess, if you're being told to do things that you kind of want to do or that really need to be done. But
it's very subtle because I can sort of see the appeal of the argument. We all have to depend on experts for things, right? Like if the engine falls out of my car, like I don't know how to fix that. Right. I need someone to tell me how to do it and hopefully do it, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
But it's consensual, right? I would go and find versus coercive, right? If someone's going to beat you over the head to fix your car,
Yeah, that's
like,
right.
that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I can't just even like it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of not. How many social situations, I show up to an event or whatever I'm supposed to speak, and people are, they're asking me some questions or whatever, and I'm like, just tell me what to do, and that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, right.
Because it's like, but that's different. I'm there to do a job, but it's a very tempting thing to just be told what to do. But it's one thing in a context, and it's another thing.
The permanent
where
feature of life.
Permanent feature of life.
Yeah.
Who's telling you what
right
to do? And
yeah,
it can get dark. It can get bad fast.
Absolutely.
And when it's run by a cult, it's surely going to be bad.
Yes. I want to touch on something again you mentioned in the video. This is another one of the species, I think.
Yeah.
Queer theory.
Oh yeah, it's a mess.
I guess what is it, first of all, and then you define queer as an identity without an essence, and I wanted you to expand upon that definition in particular.
So first of all, I didn't do that.
Oh.
That's me quoting the guy who defined it, which is frightening. But queer theory is a Marxist theory of normalcy and legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So some of us people out there, we said we're the normal ones. Those guys are the weirdos. They're abnormal. They're perverts.
Mm-hmm.
They're kinksters. They're whatever, right? They're the freaks.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get to live the good life. They have to be on the margins of society.
Mm-hmm.
They can't have the drag queen performance wherever they want. They have to do it at a burlesque at night, or whatever. So they're marginalized because normal people said, this is what's normal and this is what's legitimate. This is how we're going to learn. This is how we're going to teach. This is how we're going to, set parameters for society. And so it's the same Marxist ideology now where normalcy and legitimacy are the basis of a cultural private property that has to be queered in their language to be undone. So what does it mean to say it's an identity without an essence? It is tied to this because the definition for queer was given by a man named David Halperin. Okay. The book is called Saint Foucault, which refers to Michel Foucault, who he was canonizing in this book, in a sense. And in the middle of the book somewhere, it's on page 62 in my copy. I just have had to cite it so many times. He starts out this paragraph. He says, unlike gay identity, which is grounded in the positive fact of homosexual object choice. So he says it's real. Gay is real. He says, unlike that, queer need not be grounded in any positive truth or any stable reality. And then he goes on to say that it is, there's nothing to which it necessarily refers. It's not based on any natural kind. It's not even a list of given perversions or deviances. It's, in fact, he said, defined entirely without any essential qualities. It's not based on reality at all. So what is it instead? He says it's a position, which is to say a political position vis-a-vis normalcy. In other words, it's a political position on what it means to be normal. And he says that it is, by definition, whatever is opposed to the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. That's the definition of queer. So when I said that it's an identity without an essence, what it's actually saying is it's not possible to be a queer identity. Mm-hmm. So they got this new show, there's Queer Planet or something like that with the animals. There's no queer animals because there are no animals with politics. It is a political belief system instead of actions. You can't be queer, you can only act queer or believe queerly. And so that's the definition of queer. It's a Marxist position on the idea of normalcy that is intentionally diametrically opposed to anything that gains the status of normalcy or legitimacy. So if gay became accepted and gay marriage is, I know it's the antiquated term for it, right. Marriage equality is the standard, well, that normalizes gay, so that's bad. They call that homonormativity. I'm not kidding. Right. Or I just saw the other day that the idea that, men can transition to women and women can transition to men, that just reasserts the sex binary. Therefore, that's transnormativity, and that's bad. You have to make trans be from whatever to anything else. And so there can't be any standards. There can't be anything where somebody comes in and says, this is legitimate and that's not legitimate, or you need to be more normal, or, whatever. So in practice, what queer theory is a theory that says anything that tells a queer theorist no is wrong. That's oppression. And so it's like the most, pun intended, I suppose, fucked Marxist theory ever. That's a word they use, by the way. Yeah. Messing with the concept of gender in people's head. We used to call it gender bending. Mm-hmm. They have a more advanced version called gender fucking.
Wow.
which is you fuck with gender for people. I mean, that's a technical academic term, so I don't know what to do with these people. So it's a Marxist theory of normalcy and legitimacy is what it boils down to.
So does this, like, one of the strange things, I saw a meme the other day, it was like counterculture in the 1980s, and it showed people dressed in like, you know, spandex leather or whatever, looking like, what's the band that, Kiss, you know, dressed
like
in
Kiss.
black and white and the makeup. And it said counterculture in 2024, and it showed like this traditional wife, you know, like with kids. And so and that could become queer then.
Sure. He says, in fact, that it doesn't necessarily refer, like it starts out with unlike gay identity, and then it goes on to say, you know, it doesn't actually just have to be, he said it's not restricted to gay men and lesbians. It can refer, he says, for example, to a married couple without children, because that's different, right? And or he says it could be a married couple with children, perhaps very naughty children, which I don't know what he's referring to there, but I have a guess.
Wow.
It's always there. It's always there.
Fuck.
Yeah, but that's the thing, because there's no, it's a Marxist philosophy that's opposed to limiting principle on principle. There's no restraint allowed whatsoever. So will it be pedophilic if it's not now? Yes. Will it be into like animals if it's not now?
Right.
Yes. Will it be into anything? Because yes, it must. Why? 100%. The second I think, let's say it's me, the second I think of some goofy sexual identity, the second I say that, and you say, dude, what? I'm like, you're oppressing me. There is nowhere, anywhere that anybody can say that I'm wrong to call you a bigot.
Right. This makes all the sense in the world. Opposed to limiting principle on principle, because private property is a limiting principle.
Yes, it is.
Right. It's my self-interest stops where your self-interest begins.
That's right. And so it's going to take down private property. It's going to take down family. It's going to take down societal structures. Anything that dares to tell it, here's where you have to stop, which answers a question. Why do you have queer theory, which comes out of radical feminism originally, which comes out of the idea that gender is not connected to sex? And then things are all tied up with sexuality. That's part of it, but we won't get into that aspect because it's not necessary. Why do you have now that the end point of radical feminism is men who decide to put on a dress and decide they're going to go in the locker room with Riley Gaines?
Yeah, what the fuck?
Well, it's because feminism has this logic of this stuff socially constructed, so we can challenge the social construction. And queer theory says, well, the place you stop, that women are real, that's socially constructed too, and you're just a bigot. And you're trying to maintain your own privilege. That's a limiting principle that I'm opposed to on principle, so now you have to let men into spaces. And then you can see the poverty of feminist logic just as tangential, because their answer is this is patriarchy. To my reply to that is, no, patriarchy would beat those dudes' asses.
Yes.
This is not patriarchy.
Right.
And their own theory says that patriarchy traps men into these toxic masculine forms. Toxic masculinity would beat the crap out of these guys. So that's snuffed.
Yeah.
We got, feministized or whatever masculinity that can't answer that, but feminist theory can't answer it either. So they're just running roughshod over everything.
Wow. Just seeing this thing self-destruct in real time. Okay. The origin of cultural Marxism. You got into this kind of towards the end of the video a little bit.
Yeah, that's where we were talking earlier about the evolution.
Yeah.
So the point was that Marxism tried its Marxism thing and it just wouldn't take in the West.
Yeah.
But it did take in Russia and then later China and so on. And the question, cultural Marxism is sometimes called Western Marxism, arose from these Marxists in Europe in the 1910s, right after World War I, during World War I actually, especially. And then after, up until maybe the 1930s, trying to answer the question of what did Marx get wrong? He must have got something wrong. Why won't it take? And so they came up with this idea that we have to infiltrate cultural institutions in the West to tear apart, family, religion. We got to take over the media. We've got to. It's not just the economic situation. It's that people are led to believe this is a good life. We have to challenge that. So it was the first step in the evolutionary leap that Marxism had to take in order to start going after Western civilization.
How did these things end up getting categorized as, I think it was anti-Semitic?
Oh, yeah. Well, it turns out not everyone, but many of the people who were the
Conspiracy theory and anti-Semitic. Were
yeah,
the two
the Wikipedia
categorizations.
there used to be a real article on Wikipedia about cultural Marxism, and it told the whole history. It kind of says there's 3 definitions of it and all this, and it was really informative. And then we started like blowing the door open on all this, and somebody edited Wikipedia, and now it just says cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. And that was one of the 3 things the original article said. And so the thing is like a lot of these early Western Marxists, just use that term instead of cultural Marxists, which has baggage here. A lot of these Western Marxists were at least ethnically Jewish. And the entire Frankfurt School, for example, of critical theory was ethnically Jewish. And so a lot of people looking at communism, seeing this happening in the West, looking back, Marx's family is Jewish, even though he was raised Lutheran, and by 19 was an avowed atheist. You can look through, there's kind of Jewish people littered throughout all of this history. Lenin had Jewish heritage, I believe. They started to say, well, cultural Marxism, the stuff that got cooked up to take over Western civilization, is a Jewish plot. So they took this angle that attacked Jews in particular in saying that it's a Jewish theory. And so it became considered a form of anti-Semitism to call out the cultural Marxists because it was being accused of being a Jewish plot to take over the West. And it's like, what did all of them have in common? And they derived from the most famous of all the Jews, Mao Zedong in China. They derived a lot of their ideas eventually from Mao. What did they all have in common? Is it that they're actually Jewish or religiously Jewish in particular? No, of course not. It's that they were religiously communist, right? But the variable gets washed out. So it became smeared as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to say that you were blaming Jews for trying to undermine Western civilization, while at the same time, unambiguously, critical theory exists. The Frankfurt School existed. It came up with ideas that we would call whether cultural, critical, or Western Marxism, or now maybe identity Marxism or woke Marxism, all comes out of that. And so it's this accusation that it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy has been very effective at preventing any criticism of those ideas as well, which is super communist, frankly,
right?
In its whole setup.
That's fucking wow. Okay, towards the end of the video, you start talking about these quote unquote global citizens.
Oh yeah, that's where it's going.
Yeah, and so what are these global citizens, and what does it have to do with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations Agenda 2030?
Yeah, so global citizenship is a term you hear a lot in education, by the way, a lot now. The first time I got clued in it, I got invited to go on the Dr. Phil show. And so I'm sitting backstage listening to these people, these woke education people up on stage talking about critical race theory. And they just keep saying that it's their responsibility to educate global citizens. And they said it, the reason I even realized this was a thing I had to look into is they said it so many times. I was like, what the hell does that mean? And I went back to because they took your phone away to go on the show. So I got my phone back later and I went to the hotel and I'm like looking it up. I'm like, holy crap, it's everywhere. And then it comes straight from the United Nations. And the idea is that they want it to sound benign, like, oh, we're all citizens of the globe, right? We're global citizens. But we're not, because they're eliding what it means to be a citizen. We talked about private property and capital. What do these really mean? Well, what is a citizen?
Right.
A citizen is somebody who has both rights secured by and responsibilities to a state.
Yeah.
So that's a relationship between people and a state, is citizenship, right? So what state is there of the globe that would define global citizenship? Like, there's not one. Right. So the plan, in my estimation, is to get people thinking that they're global citizens, and then to say, well, as a global citizen, what do we get out of that? What does it mean? And so all of a sudden, these global entities, like maybe the UN or maybe CCP, depending on how that's worked out, get to define, oh, yeah, you're all citizens of the globe, and here's the human rights that we protect, and here are your responsibilities. And in the literature about it, it's really chilling, because they actually say, well, what are the rights? This is explicit in this book I have, Global Education for Global Citizenship. It says, well, what are the rights of a global citizen? This is right out of the gate. And then a paragraph later, it says, well, let's answer that. global citizenship is not so concerned with rights as it is concerned with responsibilities. And then the definition throughout the rest of the book is that what defines being a global citizen, living up to those responsibilities, is having committed to helping the United Nations achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. At least for now. After 2030, there'll be some new picture. So you're a global citizen if you're actually a global subject of the United Nations and its agendas. Wow. And they're just trying to pass this off like it's this cute term to say that, oh, I'm a person on Earth. And
that is...
So people often corner me and say, James, you're not really Christian. Why do you use the word demonic to describe these people? And I'm like, look at what they do. Judge them by their fruits.
Yes. So global citizens with no rights, but only responsibilities. And again, back to private property. It's a symmetry of rights and responsibilities. Like
right.
I have the right to use the thing that I own and enjoy it, but I also have the responsibility to maintain it. Otherwise, it's not going to be a thing for long. But we're talking about a situation where global citizens have no rights, only responsibilities. That sounds like
right. They have no rights. They have. It is. It's exactly. It is the road straight to serfdom. That is servitude. It is. You don't have rights. You have the privileges they grant you under the brand name human rights.
Wow.
So there's no inalienable right because it's ultimately a privilege.
Right.
And if it has to be suspended for a time, for the greater good, so be it.
Right.
So maybe you do have a right to bodily autonomy, except when we have to vaccinate everybody for a pandemic. And if you have a right except when, you don't have a right.
That's right. Yeah, it's an entitlement. So
that's right.
And if it can be revoked arbitrarily, then it's not an entitlement. Okay. You've talked about the Chinese social credit scoring system.
Yeah.
It's something we touch on a lot with central bank digital currencies.
Yeah.
Obviously it's...
because there's a mechanism that makes it work.
Can't have one without the other. Like I think any central bank digital currency coming to the West is basically the canary in the coal mine for the social credit scoring system. How is wokeism related to the rollout of, say, a Chinese-style social credit scoring system in the West?
Yeah, it's the value system for the social values that define that part. So there would still be like a financial responsibility aspect, just like there is in China today. And the Chinese social credit, just to disclaim, the Chinese social credit thing is complicated. The central government has a fairly limited hands-on role. Regional governments have them. Sometimes the central government gets upset. Sometimes the central government likes it, but at any moment, the CCP could decide that's the model, everybody has it. And they say that they're not interested in pursuing that, but what does that mean? What kind of a guarantee is that from an authoritarian government? Yeah, we don't have any interest in it today, and tomorrow they could change their mind. And what is anybody going to say about it? Plus, they have more implementation than people let on. Just to disclaim that there's controversy around that subject, so that we don't get accused of being ignorant to it. But there's a values component, and the values that determine your social credit are going to be determined by sustainability, which is mostly environmental stuff, woke, inclusive values, which is all the woke ideology stuff, and then probably self-governance. So your ESG model is actually going to work toward individual scoring. Are you environmentally responsible? Do you govern yourself according to the standards that the central authority says you should? And are you creating the inclusive world that they say? I have a feeling that if they actually were to implement this, that inclusion wouldn't be very important for very long. Like it would mean something a lot different very quickly. But that's actually the real danger of these. I don't think that they're a good idea at all, but when you have that kind of a system in place, that system is by definition immediately arbitrary. The people who get to define what those words mean get to define how everybody lives.
Right.
And you're in a, they say the rat race. You're literally in some kind of like rat experimental maze where if I do this, I get that. If I do that, I get punished, I get burned, I get shocked, I can't buy my food. And like you therefore are entered into a fully immersive brainwashing environment to do what the government wants you to do at all times. And by making that system as tight as they want or as loose as they want, they can control how heavy-handed it is. They don't have to use a gun. They don't have to use any force at all. They can just turn off your access to your money, which is if they have that central currency, or they can redirect your money because central bank digital currencies aren't money, they're coupons.
Right.
So your money your digital dollar might be only able to spend 50 per week on food.
Right.
And then you could have 10 million and it doesn't matter.
Right.
The other, I'm not even going to do the numbers, all but 50. You can go buy a car, but you can't buy any food with it. It's like it's like coupons at the grocery store.
Yeah.
If you have a coupon for coffee, you can't go buy meat with it. You can only get $4 off coffee. Right. So that's how their money works. They call it fully programmable.
Yeah.
And programmable means they get to decide what you buy and how much of it, and your social credit score can be tied to that. But it's the values system is what's at the heart of it with woke. The S in ESG is social justice.
Right.
The scary part of it is all of that can change overnight at any point, at any time.
Right.
They can decide you're socially good today and socially bad tomorrow if they want, once they have it.
Yeah. So the CBDC is neither private nor property, basically, because obviously it's being fully surveyed inside of their system. And then it's not property because they control how much you spend it, what you spend it on, when you can spend it. If you say the wrong thing, you can't spend it.
It's a similar thing to the erosion of property rights we were talking about earlier. All of us, it's like, yeah, they're your credits, but somebody else has a hand on the scale in terms of how those credit. You just
so it's not yours, right?
So it's not really yours.
If you don't have the power to control and exclude others, then you don't really own it.
That's right.
So it's not private. So it's not private. It's not property. We're back to private property again.
Yeah,
that's used to facilitate this social engineering rat maze, as you describe it. Right?
It's a video game controlled by the government, used for the purposes of controlling citizens and economies. Crazy. And then life becomes a matter of getting the score in the video game that you want to be able to do what you want to do.
Sickening. Okay, one last thesis I want to share with you, and then we'll go have some food. And I shared this with you, I think, before the show, but it's been said that the two greatest dangers to the state are a unified population and people capable of critical thinking. Like if you have those two things, the state's kind of shit out of luck because it's a giant scam, tax farm, basically. So it seems to me like there would be a motivation for the state to sponsor psyops like wokeism, like mainstream media propaganda, etc., to actually attack the definitions of words. Because if you can attack the definitions of words and you can break consensus on these terms, like we've touched on a lot today, right? That equity means one thing and means a different thing over here, and what does whiteness mean? What is all these different terms that get transformed through these the application of these ideologies? Then you can prevent people from being able to engage in rational discourse. You're sort of short-circuiting the open source software that is English in this case, or any language for that matter.
Yeah, for sure.
And then when you compromise the domain of rational discourse, it's like there's two ways to resolve disputes, right? You can discourse, you can dialogue, rational dialogue, or we can have physical dispute. And in the domain of physical dispute, well, the state is the king, right? The state is the monopoly on violence. So do you think wokeism, there's some purpose embedded in wokeism that it's aimed at short-circuiting human rationality itself?
I mean, as an ideology, that's, I think, certainly the case. And that goes back to Marx. As for, is this kind of like the psyops aspect? That's the same question we were asking before, like who put Marx up to it, right? Or who put Lenin up to it? Are there the puppet masters behind the puppet masters, so to speak? And I don't know the answer to that for certain, but I do know for sure that, this is a very interesting part of the story, is that in 2011, the powers that be, particularly at the big banks, were basically shitting their pants. Occupy Wall Street was a massive populist movement, economic populist movement on the left, that realized that the banks were really causing the problems. And the Tea Parties over here already kind of infiltrated by, big neoliberal money, but they're over here on the cusp of realizing, in a sense, that they have common cause with Occupy people.
Right.
Which it's all of a sudden what you have is people that are relatively well informed, as you were saying,
Unified.
that are unified,
Yeah.
which means they're in trouble. And the antidote to this was woke identity politics, which had been bubbling up. Was that planted? I doubt it, honestly. That had been bubbling up because the Marxists, if that got started by people planting it, how it got money over the years, these are all questions I don't honestly know the answer to. It gets conspiratorial and shady. But the fact of the matter is that the people who've bought into Marxism are committed religious lunatics. And so they're going to do it anyway. So the academia was making these theories the stuff you read in the 90s everybody else was laughing that it's all a dead end, but we just let them have their jobs basically, which is a neat story about funding frivolous stuff in a society. If you want to keep your society healthy, don't do that. But at any rate, I think it largely that the tool chest evolved primarily through this interaction of activists and academics. That's really they're some of the both of the same people, activist academics with a hyphen. In 2011, big institutional players, particularly like Goldman Sachs, these big banks, picked those tools up because they knew, it's like the boss is always looking for the union buster, right? You've got the Occupy Wall Street movement, and you can talk to or read interviews with or watch interviews with any of the big organizers, most of whom were white men, by the way. And what they said was it all went intersectional. It was all like point of personal privilege, and we have to let the black women speak first. And they just said they eventually threw up their hands. We can't get anything done with these people. And then meanwhile, Goldman Sachs is like, racial justice, and they're promoting it. And then they're also hiding behind the shield. It's like the regular emblem, but the rainbow flag or whatever. They started pushing all of these woke theories, which tore apart the solidarity of Occupy. Meanwhile, what were they doing to the Tea Party? Racist, homophobic, haters, deplorables eventually became the catchword for this. So they were denigrating the Tea Party, especially to leftists that were in that milieu. So they're not going to make common cause with racists and xenophobes and haters and so on. And then they're tearing apart the leftist populist movement at the same time. And the corporate involvement for like 2010 to 2013 went from like 0 to 100% in these ideologies very, very, very quickly. And a lot of that was probably coordinated by the very large banks realizing that it was a sword and shield to protect themselves and that they could use their institutional status to coerce other corporations to get on board, which is what became the ESG program.
Wow.
ESG, by the way, was invented at the United Nations for exactly what it's used for today, is to force impact investing and to force the hands of corporations. But it didn't really get off the ground as a major institutional force until the 2010s. And so therefore, is that a psyops? Was it done by governments? I mean, the governments and like we're not operating in a separated public and private sector economy anymore. We have a public-private sector, in other words, an oligarchy already functionally operating. And the oligarchy very, very likely deployed this set of armaments for exactly the purposes you're talking about. It's the most powerful divide and conquer tool that the West has seen in centuries. It was at least as powerful, maybe more powerful, arguably, in China during the Cultural Revolution. But that's what it's modeled after. I mean, it's literally modeled after that. So,
right, yeah, no, as you said, the organizer of Occupy Wall Street, I heard him say, I think it was years after that, he said we made a mistake. We occupied Wall Street, and we should have occupied the Fed.
Yeah.
I mean, given everything we've talked about today, like what is the role of central banking, fiat currency, and all of this social engineering?
Well, I mean, obviously, when you have fiat currency, you can fund all the activism that you need to at any time because you can just make money appear out of nowhere to fund it.
Yeah.
So there is that concern. It's likely that central banking is likely to be behind, like when we're talking about the people that are the puppet masters, puppet masters, because woke and things like that work as a sword and a shield to protect
Right.
that highly corrupt institution. And that's the bad emperor problem, right? They're in control of their central banks. They're in charge of the entire society's money supply in a very real sense. And so when you have that level of it, they could start, I don't think it did, but it could have started off with the best of intentions. And that's still going to turn as corrupt as it can get because just the nature of where it is and what it is. So certainly the future of where it wants to go depends on massively increased power to central banks. It's likely that they understand that these things are a tool and you don't have to read any documents at all to find out the World Bank is virtually involved in all of the funding behind all of this. Like almost everything lists the World Bank as one of its funders if it's some woke thing.
Yeah.
So it's very clear that they, enjoy the power and privilege that's afforded to them by being a tool of those central banks, which of course makes it super ironic that it's a left ideology, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because, this is what the left used to stand against, right?
Well, we talked about Yuri Bezmenov, called them political prostitutes. He said, don't waste your time with those political prostitutes because the left isn't leftists as leftists. I'm not talking about people who have, higher threshold of tolerance or I'm talking about leftists. They are in a religion that worships power. So whatever gives them power is good. Anything that exerts power over them is bad. So if they can believe that something like BlackRock can give them power, BlackRock's great. Or the pharmaceutical industry. Big Pharma, by producing the shots during COVID, gave them the ability to go around and yell at everybody. So they loved it.
Ooh, James, man, this has been a long, insightful, very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, this is great.
We covered a lot of ground. And
this exceeded my expectations.
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with. I hope this is useful for people clicking out of the pathos back into the logos, and hopefully, this exploration of this complex area will help people think about it with more nuance and depth, because that seems to be the only solution, frankly. And
it's a big paradigm shift, a mind shift to go from this is happening to this is being done to us.
Yes.
I know that if there's any Marxists at all that are watching, they're all laughing about these ironies that we're regurgitating Marxist theory, but we're not. But these are the insights into which Marx tapped in order to create oppression is a dynamic that's being done to people, imposed on people. Well, that's true, but they're projecting because they're the ones that are imposing it when they get power. A classical liberal or libertarian viewpoint seeks not to. Its fundamental belief is that nobody has the political authority to do that to anybody else.
Yeah.
And if I want to have authority over you, I have to demonstrate some capacity that you're willing to say, you know what, I want you to be my teacher or my captain or whatever it happens to be.
Consent,
that's right. And that's earned through, ideally, merit and character, demonstrating that I'm somebody worth, in a sense, to use the word a little bit correctly, but a little bit weirdly, submitting to.
Yeah.
But that's voluntary.
Yeah, it's really not unbelievably complicated, and then that dispenses with the oppression and all of these other words. It's like,
so it's just super important to me that people, why do we want to name this? Well, first of all, you want to know what historical currents it's caught up in, because those historical currents, I guess history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, or however it goes.
Right.
Those historical currents are going to play out similar forces and similar dynamics. They're going to play out in similar ways. What does that mean practically? In our world right now, if we went full into at least 1 billion, I think 6, frankly, billion people dead. The 100 million of China through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward is pittance compared to what would happen if they're able to completely collapse the first world. And so it's important to realize, this is happening. I see these doomers on the internet all the time, and they share these memes that this is a dying society, or these are the symptoms of a dying society. And I'm like, no, this is an attempted murder of our civilization, which is a different thing.
Yeah.
It's like the boots on our neck. The guy has the gun to our head. But if we get out from underneath and we get the gun away from him, we got a shot.
Yeah.
It's not, oh crap, our civilization got sick and it's going to die.
Right.
It's a totally different mindset. It's a totally different proactive mindset. And then unlike Marxism, it's not that we necessarily need to band together in this fascist solidarity to take power and wield it. I mean, there will be the need to wield power, but what it actually undoes this in the end is lots of people deciding that if I can take care of myself, I don't need any of this. So the call back to individual responsibility, from which is a platform for expressing individual liberty and feeling confident in yourself. Like, I deserve to do what I want because I'm responsible. I'm not a, screw up. So let me live my life. That attitude, you get 3 to 4%, certainly 10% of the population feeling and thinking that way. It changes the whole game.
Beautiful place to end it. Thank you so much, James.
Yeah, thank you.